The wind came down from the north like a blade. It screamed across the vast, empty plains of Sagebrush Bend, carrying a payload of ice and snow that scoured the land and erased the horizon. For Maren Alder, the sound was the voice of a familiar enemy, a constant companion in the long, silent winters since her husband, Thomas, had been taken by the river. The small cabin, built by his own hands, groaned under the assault. The wind found every crack in the timber, every chink in the daubing, and drove needles of coal deep into the single room she called home. Maren, a woman whose face was beginning to show the fine etchings of her early 30s and the deeper grooves of hardship, stood by the stone hearth, her hands outstretched to a fire that fought a losing battle against the chill. Her hands were not delicate. They were maps of her life. The palms calloused from the plow handles and the rough rope of the well at Silver Thread Creek. The knuckles swollen from hauling water and splitting wood. They were strong hands, capable hands. But tonight, they felt small and inadequate against the fury of the blizzard. The woodpile was running low. It was a chore she should have done before dusk. But a stubborn calf had taken all her afternoon. Now, with the world dissolving into a maelstrom of white, she had no choice. Pulling Thomas's old sheepskin coat tighter around her shoulders, she braced herself, lifted the heavy iron latch, and pushed the door open into the roaring chaos. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it against the exterior wall with a crack like a gunshot. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, blasted into the room, momentarily blinding her. She fought her way out onto the small porch, her boots sinking into the rapidly deepening drifts. The woodpile, a dark, oblong shape against the swirling white, was barely 20 yards away, but it seemed a mile. Each step was a struggle against the gale that tried to rip the breath from her lungs and push her back. The air was so cold it felt solid, a physical weight pressing in on her. She reached the pile, her fingers already numb, and began to pull at the frozen logs. It was then that she saw it, a stain of impossible darkness against the snow-covered wood. At first, she thought it was a shadow, a trick of the fading light and the storm. But as she squinted, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, small and still, lying crumpled on the icy timber. Maren's heart seized in her chest, a cold fist of fear clenching tighter than the winter's grip. Her first instinct was to retreat, to slam the door and pretend she had seen nothing. In this land, the unknown was rarely a friend. Trouble, like a wolf, often came on silent feet. But Thomas's voice, a gentle echo in her memory, chided her. You don't leave a soul to the storm. Maren, not even a stray dog. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she waded through the snow, her lantern casting a weak, flickering circle of light. It was a boy, an Indian boy, from the look of his dark, braided hair spilling from under a thin cap. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. His lips were the color of ash, cracked and tinged with blue. A dark, jagged cut marred the skin above his right eyebrow. A line of frozen blood stark against his pale, cold flesh. A few feet from his outstretched hand, half buried in the snow, lay a small hatchet, its handle worn smooth with use. Maren knelt, her gloved hand hovering over the boy's face. He was still breathing, the puffs of air small and ragged. She touched the wound on his forehead. The blood there was frozen solid. But when she brushed the snow away from the collar of his thin buckskin shirt, she saw another, newer smear of crimson. Her fingers came away wet and startlingly warm. This was fresh. He hadn't been out here for long. As if on cue, the wind shifted, and for a fleeting moment, its howl subsided. In that brief pocket of quiet, she heard it, the distant, rhythmic jingle of harness bells, and, fainter still, the guttural sound of a man's curse, ripped away by the returning gale. They were looking for him. Her eyes darted towards the split-rail fence that marked the edge of her property. There, in a patch of wind-scoured ground, she could just make out the dark pockmarks of hoofprints. The trail stopped abruptly near the fence line, then veered sharply east, towards the dark, looming silhouette of Cormorant Ridge. They had lost his trail in the storm, but they hadn't given up. They were still out there, circling, hunting. All thoughts of her own safety evaporated, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct she hadn't felt since she'd lost her own child, a baby who had lived only 3 days. This boy was dying, and there were men out in the storm who wanted him to. Looking at his thin frame, the hollows beneath his cheekbones, she knew he was not a threat. He was a child, freezing and bleeding in her yard. "All right, then," she murmured, her words snatched away by the wind. "Let's get you out of this." She slid her arms beneath the boy, surprised by how little he weighed. He was a bundle of sticks and cold skin, light as a sack of feathers. He moaned softly as she lifted him, his head lolling against her shoulder. The fear was still there, a cold snake in her gut. She knew the whispers that passed through the town of Redemption. She knew the penalty for helping an Indian, especially one who was being hunted. They would call her a sympathizer, a traitor to her own kind. They could burn her out, or worse. But looking down at the child in her arms, his life a fragile flicker against her chest, she knew she had no other choice. She would not let him die on her woodpile. Getting back to the cabin was an ordeal. The boy was a dead weight, and the wind fought her every step of the way. She finally stumbled onto the porch, her lungs burning, and managed to shoulder the door open just enough to squeeze inside. She kicked it shut and threw the heavy bar across it, the sound of the wood slotting into place, a small, defiant boom against the storm's roar. The silence within the cabin was sudden and profound, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. She laid the boy down gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth, the closest place to warmth. His clothes were soaked through and stiff with ice. Working quickly, she stripped off the frozen buckskin, wincing at the coldness of his skin. He was thin, his ribs starkly visible beneath his flesh. Aside from the gash on his head, she found a long, shallow cut on his side, the source of the fresh blood. It wasn't deep, but it had bled freely. She stoked the fire until it roared to life, its heat pushing back the cabin's encroaching chill. She filled a kettle with water from the bucket and swung it over the flames. While it heated, she found her sewing kit, a small wooden box containing needles, gut thread, and a few precious spools of cotton. Selecting a sturdy needle, she held it in the fire with a pair of tongs until the tip glowed a bright, angry red. The boy began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering. He was coming back to the world of pain. He tossed his head back and forth, muttering, his voice a dry, feverish rasp. The words were disjointed, tumbling out in a mixture of his own tongue and broken English. But Marin caught 3 words that made the blood run cold in her veins. River Road, Powder, Cutter, Cutter, Ephraim Cutter. The name settled in the room like a shroud. A cattle baron who had bought up half the valley, whose influence stretched all the way to the territorial capital. A man known for his polite smiles and his ruthless methods. A man whose riders were said to be more like an army than a group of ranch hands. What could this boy possibly have to do with him? Before she could ponder the question, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, the unmistakable thump and crunch of horses' hooves in deep snow. Coming closer. Marin froze, the hot needle still in the tongs. She rushed to the small window, wiping a patch of frost from the glass. 3 figures on horseback were emerging from the swirling gray-white curtain of the storm. They were large men, bundled in thick greatcoats, their hats pulled low. One of them held a lantern aloft, its yellow light swinging wildly, casting monstrous, dancing shadows against the snow. There was no time to think. Her mind raced, sifting through 100 panicked thoughts and settling on one desperate plan. "The cellar," she whispered. She scooped the boy up from the rug. He was heavier now, a limp and awkward weight. She half dragged, half carried him to the trap door set in the floorboards at the back of the cabin. She wrenched it open, revealing a black square that smelled of damp earth, potatoes, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. "You have to be quiet," she hissed, though she doubted he could understand. "No matter what you hear, you stay quiet." She lowered him into the darkness, propping him against a row of potato sacks. She grabbed several empty burlap bags, shaking them out to release the strong, earthy smell, and draped them over him, hoping the scent would be enough to cover the metallic tang of blood. She slammed the trapdoor shut, slid the heavy wooden crate of preserves back over it, and kicked a stray piece of firewood under the rug where he had lain. She had just managed to throw the boy's wet clothes onto a drying rack near the fire when a heavy fist pounded on the door. 1 beat, 2, 3, each one a hammer blow against her heart. She took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her apron, forcing her hands to stop shaking. She walked to the door, her steps measured, her face set in a mask of weary neutrality. She lifted the bar and pulled the door inward just a crack. The man in the center was massive, his face ruddy from the cold, framed by a thick, dark beard. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, cold blue, as devoid of warmth as a winter sky. He swept his hat off, revealing a bald head. A smile spread across his lips, but it never reached his eyes. This was Ephraim Cutter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone that seemed utterly at odds with the violent storm and the menace of his presence. "Apologies for the intrusion at this hour. Nasty night." "It is," Marin replied, her own voice tight. She kept her body positioned to block the view into the cabin. "What can I do for you, mister?" "Cutter, Ephraim Cutter." He introduced himself, as if she wouldn't know. "My men and I are tracking a runaway. A little Sioux thief stole some property of mine. We tracked him this far, but the snow's covered his trail. You haven't seen a boy. Have you lost and alone in the storm?" The lie came easily, born of pure adrenaline. "No one's been by here, man or boy, just me in the storm since yesterday." Cutter's pale eyes roamed past her, into the warm light of the cabin. She saw his gaze flicker over the roaring fire, a fire perhaps too large for one person alone. She saw him notice the rack of wet clothing, though from his angle he couldn't have made out what they were. He continued to smile his empty smile. "I see. A shame. It's a bad night to be lost." He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled something out. He extended his hand, and with a flick of his thumb, he placed a single, long, rust-colored iron nail on the edge of her door frame. It sat there, stark and ugly against the worn wood. "Well, if you do happen to see him, you send word to my ranch on Cormorant Ridge. There's a reward." It was not an offer. It was a threat. The nail was a message: I am claiming this place. I am watching this place. I will be back to drive this nail home. "I'll do that," Marin said, her voice steady despite the tremor that ran through her. Cutter held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent contest of wills across the threshold. Then he nodded curtly, placed his hat back on his head, and turned. "Come on, boys. Nothing here." The 3 men mounted their horses and were quickly swallowed by the blizzard, their lantern a fading ember that soon winked out entirely. Marin stood frozen for a long moment, the icy wind whipping her hair across her face. Then, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed the heavy door shut, the wind fighting her until the last inch. She dropped the bar back into place, the sound echoing the finality of her decision. Leaning her back against the solid wood, she closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The cabin was safe. For now. But as the wind howled outside, sounding now like a chorus of hungry wolves, she knew this was not over. The storm outside was a temporary thing. It would pass. The storm Cutter had brought to her door, however, had only just begun. Tonight was not just the night of a blizzard. It was the first night of a siege. The silence that followed the departure of Cutter's men was heavier and more menacing than the storm itself. The wind still shrieked, But the immediate, human threat had receded, leaving Marin's heartbeat echoing painfully in her ears. She waited, counting to 100, listening for the sound of returning hooves, for a trick. Nothing came but the scrape of icy branches against the roof. Slowly, she moved the crate of preserves. The wood groaned against the floorboards, a sound loud enough to make her wince. She lifted the trap door. A puff of cold, damp air rose from the darkness, carrying the scent of potatoes and turned earth. "They're gone." Her voice was a low rasp. At first, there was no response. Then, a pair of eyes gleamed in the gloom. He was awake. He had been awake the entire time, listening. She saw the terror in them, the bright, animal awareness of a creature trapped. "It's safe," she said, her voice softer. She reached a hand down. "Come up to the fire. You're freezing." He flinched as her hand neared, but he didn't pull away. After a long, agonizing pause, a small, cold hand grasped her forearm. She pulled him up, his movements stiff and pained. He was shivering uncontrollably now, his body reacting to the thaw. She guided him back to the bearskin rug, closer to the hearth's warmth. His dark eyes darted around the small cabin, taking in the barred door, the single window, the rack where his own wet clothes were steaming slightly. He was a prisoner, and he knew it. Marin turned her back on him deliberately, a gesture of trust. She went to the kettle, poured some of the hot water into a tin mug, and stirred in a thick spoonful of blackstrap molasses. It was the quickest way she knew to get warmth and strength into a body. She set the mug on the hearth, near his hand, but not forcing it on him. "Many," she said, pointing to the cup. It was one of the few Lakota words she'd picked up from the mail rider, Jedediah, who traded with the tribes up north. Water, waste. "Good." He stared at the mug, then at her. His gaze was impossibly old for a boy of 12, filled with a deep, bottomless suspicion. But the shivering was violent now, shaking his whole frame. His need won out. He reached for the mug with both hands, his fingers trembling so hard he nearly spilled it. He brought it to his cracked lips and drank, the hot, sweet liquid seeming to unlock something in him. When the mug was empty, he wrapped his hands around it, absorbing the last of its heat. "They hunt me," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. His English was broken, but clear enough. "Ephraim Cutter," Marin said. It was a statement, not a question. The boy flinched, a visceral reaction to the name. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "He is a snake in the snow. He hides his trail." He began to speak, the words tumbling out in a feverish, fragmented rush. He told her of his people, the Sioux, but not as one tribe. There was the North Camp, led by a proud, foolish chief. There was the South Camp, his own people, who wanted only peace and the land promised to them by treaties that were already yellowing. Cutter comes to the North Camp. They are hungry. The buffalo are thin. He promises tallow, meat, flour. Chaska's lip curled. He lies. He brings no food. He brings Emniwakin, whiskey, and new guns. He said Cutter offered this poison and these weapons in exchange for one thing: the northern band must raid the homesteads along the Silver Thread, create chaos, smear the reputation of all Sioux, especially the peaceful southern band. Cutter wanted the settlers to panic, to demand protection, to abandon their claims. But the chief, he is proud, but not a dog. He will not attack women, not children. Marin frowned. But the barns, the fires. Jedediah said there were raids. Chaska shook his head, his eyes burning with a new light, not just fever, but fury. Not us, not the people. It is Cutter's men, his arrangers. Toka, enemies. Men with no tribe, faces covered. They burn the hay, they shoot the cattle. And they leave this. He made the motion of dropping something. An arrow, a broken lance. They make it look like us. So the soldiers will come. So the settlers will sell their land to him for nothing. It was a cold, intricate web of deceit. Cutter was pitting everyone against each other: settler, soldier, and Sioux, and he would be the only one left to claim the spoils. "And you?" Marin asked, her voice barely audible. "Where did he find you?" "I know the land," Chaska said, a trace of pride in his voice. "I know the creeks, the game trails. His men, they caught me trapping rabbits. They took me, said I would be their guide, show them the hidden farms, the weak fences." He had traveled with them for 2 days, forced to lead them through his own land. He had refused, at first, and one of the men had struck him with a rifle butt, the source of the gash on his head. Then, last night, in the growing storm, he saw his chance. They stopped at a migrant's barn, an old sod house, empty. I thought they would rest. His breathing hitched, but they unloaded crates, heavy, from a wagon. They hid them under the hay. He leaned closer, his eyes wide, as if the memory was burning him. It was the black powder, barrels of it, enough to blow the mountain down. He knew then they were not just planning small fires. They were planning a massacre, something big enough to bring in the army. He realized they would never let him go. He was a witness. He saw his hatchet on the saddle of the man who had struck him. He grabbed it and ran. He'd cut the picket line of one of their horses as a distraction and fled into the blizzard, the sound of their shouts and the first few bullets lost in the wind. As his story finished, the cabin fell silent again. Marin processed the information, her mind reeling. This was bigger than a stolen cow or a land dispute. This was a private war, and Cutter was manufacturing it. The wind outside seemed to howl with a new, personal malice. It was then that Marin noticed the smoke in the cabin. The fire was burning too high, the chimney throwing a thick, dark plume into the storm. A beacon. "Stay here," she ordered. She grabbed the iron stove poker and began to break apart the main logs, pushing them to the sides of the hearth, smothering the flames against the stone. She left only the deep, red heart of the embers, enough to give heat but not a betraying column of smoke. The light in the room dropped, plunging them into a world of flickering shadows. She pulled on Thomas's heavy boots. They were 2 sizes too large, the sole wider than her own. She slipped back out onto the porch, bracing herself against the renewed assault of the cold. The hunters were still out there. She could feel them, just beyond the perimeter of her small clearing. She had to give them something to follow. Fighting the wind. She walked away from the woodpile, past the fence line, heading not toward Cormorant Ridge, but east, toward the dense thicket of pines at the edge of her property. She dragged her feet, stumbling intentionally, creating a messy, desperate trail. She pressed her hand into the snow once, as if a runner had fallen. She went 50 yards, 100, until the cabin was just a faint smudge of light behind her. Then, carefully, meticulously, she began to walk backward, stepping exactly into her own prints, until she was back in the wind-scoured patch near her fence. From there, she returned to the cabin. She barred the door and leaned against it, her chest heaving. Now, they would find a trail leading into the woods, a place where a man could get lost for good. It might buy them an hour. It might buy them the night. She turned to the boy. He was slumped against the wall, his head bowed, the shivering replaced by a dry, still heat. He was burning with fever. As she approached, a long, mournful cry echoed across the snowfields, a lone coyote, calling to a pack that wasn't there. The sound hit Marin like a physical blow. It was the same sound she had heard the night Thomas died. It hadn't been a blizzard then, but a summer storm that had turned the placid silver thread into a raging, muddy giant, a flash flood in the dark. He had gone out to save the horses, and the bank had given way, the roar of the water, and beneath it that same lonely howl. She had found him at dawn, tangled in the roots of a cottonwood 1/2 mile downstream. She closed her eyes, steadying herself against the memory. She had stood on this porch, a new widow, and watched the water recede. She had made a promise to the unforgiving land, then it would not take anything else from her. She would not let it. She looked at the feverish boy. "Not tonight. I will not let another one die on my property." The resolve settled her. The hands that had trembled when she spoke to Cutter were now perfectly steady. She found her sewing kit. She found the bottle of whiskey Jedediah had left last Christmas, for snakebite or sorrow. "This will sting," she said. She uncorked the bottle and poured a small amount onto a clean rag, then dabbed at the gash on his forehead. The boy hissed, his body tensing, but he didn't pull away. The cut on his side was shallow, already scabbing. The head wound was the problem. It was deep and dirty. She heated the needle in the embers until it glowed orange, quenching it in the whiskey to clean it. "Hold still." She threaded the needle with gut. Her first stitch was clean and sure. The boy's breathing was shallow, his eyes squeezed shut, but he remained utterly still. She worked with a practiced efficiency, the small, neat stitches pulling the skin together, closing the wound against the infection she feared more than Cutter. When she was done, she tied off the thread, placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, and covered him with her heaviest quilt. She sat in the cabin's one good chair, her shotgun across her lap, and prepared to wait out the night. The embers provided a dull red glow. The only sounds were the boy's feverish breathing and the relentless wind. An hour passed, then 2. The storm was not abating. Maren felt a creeping exhaustion, her eyelids heavy. She must have dozed, because she was jolted awake by a new sound. It was not the wind, it was not the house settling. It was a knock. Her heart leaped into her throat. Cutter. He was back, but this knock was different. It wasn't the heavy, arrogant pounding of before. It was light, soft, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. Chaska was instantly awake, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to push himself up, to scramble back toward the cellar. Maren put a hand out. "Shh, stay." She rose silently, shotgun in hand, and moved to the window. She scraped a tiny peephole in the frost. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't Cutter. Standing on her porch, as if materialized from the snow itself, was an older Indian man. He wore only a thin buffalo robe, draped over one shoulder, his bare chest exposed to the gale. He seemed immune to the cold. His face was a web of deep lines, dignified and severe. Behind him, partially obscured by the swirling snow, sat 2 more men on horseback. They were perfectly still, armed with rifles, their faces indiscernible. They were warriors. Maren's mind raced. If they were from the northern camp, they were here for Chaska, to silence him or return him. She was trapped between 2 enemies. She moved to the door, her shotgun held low, out of sight. She lifted the heavy bar, the thunk of the wood seeming to shake the cabin. She opened the door just a crack, the width of her hand, keeping her foot braced against it. The old man did not move. He simply looked at her. His eyes were not cold like Cutter's, nor frantic like the boy's. They were calm, deep, and filled with an unshakable certainty. "I am Tate Ironcloud," he said. His voice was like stones rolling in a riverbed, his English clear and precise. "I am looking for my nephew. He ran from the northern camp. He broke the law of the bands. He did not listen to the wisdom of the chief." It was a statement, not an accusation. He was here for the boy. Maren's grip tightened on the door. "He is here," she said. There was no point in lying to eyes like those. "He is safe." "He must be returned," Tate said, his voice flat. "He has caused great trouble. His path is not his own to choose." "He's a child," Maren said, her own voice sharp, defensive. "And he's wounded. There are men out there hunting him." "Not your men, white men. They'll kill him if they find him." Tate Ironcloud stared at her, his gaze penetrating. She felt as if he were reading every thought, every fear, every loss she had ever endured. "Cutter's men," she whispered. The name caused a flicker, the barest narrowing of the old man's eyes. He knew. "The boy's fate is the law of the people," Tate said, though his certainty seemed to have lessened by a fraction. "He is not dying tonight," Marin said, her voice low and fierce, the strength of her grief for Thomas rising in her. "He is not dying for your law, and he is not dying for Cutter's greed. He is under my roof. Here, there is only my law. No one is dying needlessly here." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind. Tate Ironcloud held her gaze. He looked past her, into the darkness of the cabin, and Marin thought he must be able to see the small lump under the quilt. He was weighing her. He was weighing the boy's life against the honor of his tribe. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He had made his decision. He reached into a small leather pouch at his waist. Marin tensed, her finger moving to the trigger, but he did not draw a weapon. He pulled out a small string of polished black stones, smooth and cold as the river bottom. He pressed them into her hand, his fingers dry and warm against her frozen skin. "The storm is the smallest threat tonight, woman of the silver thread," he said. "You have chosen a dangerous path. You stand between two fires." He closed her fingers over the beads. "If you find yourself in a snare you cannot break, show these. Those who know will understand." Before she could form a reply, he stepped back. He turned, the wind catching his robe, and walked toward his silent escort. He did not look back. In seconds, he and his riders were gone, not just hidden by the snow, but absorbed by it, as if they were spirits of the storm itself. Marin shut the door and barred it. She sagged against the wood, her knees weak. She opened her hand. The black beads were heavy, solid, and cold, a tangible piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer just hiding a boy from a blizzard. She was now a player in a game whose rules she did not know, holding a promise from a man who was neither an enemy nor an ally. The wind had died, but the silence it left behind was a vacuum, pulling in every other sound, the scrape of the bar sliding back, the boy's shallow breathing, the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Marin Alder sat in the cabin's one chair, the string of black stones from Tate Ironcloud heavy in her palm. They were a cold, hard reality. His visit hadn't been a rescue. It had been a warning. She was caught, as he said, between two fires, Cutter's armed malice and the complex, unforgiving laws of the Sioux. She looked at the boy, Chaska. He had drifted into a fitful, feverish sleep, the quilt pulled up to his chin. He was the spark, but Cutter, she knew, was the powder keg. She had survived by being invisible, by making her small farm seem too poor and too rugged to be worth the trouble. That invisibility was now gone, burned away by the light of Cutter's lantern. If she did nothing, if she simply waited for the thaw, Pike and his men would return. They would not knock. She needed to understand what she was fighting. Survival was no longer enough. Now she needed leverage. When the boy's eyes fluttered open hours later, the fever glaze had receded, replaced by the same sharp, cautious intelligence she had seen in the cellar. The sun was a weak, gray smear in the sky. The storm had paused, catching its breath. "Cutter," she said, her voice quiet but insistent. "The powder, where did you see it?" He was weak, but the urgency in her voice pulled him upright. He pointed east. "Badger Cut, where the river turns back on itself." Marin knew the place, an old, abandoned line shack used by trappers 2 decades ago, now collapsing. "How do you know it was his?" "The wood," Chaska whispered. He took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on the smooth wood of the floor, sketched a symbol, a letter C, with a long, cruel barb at its base, like a fishhook. "It is carved in the beam. His mark." She nodded. Cutter branded everything his cattle, his wagons, his men. It stood to reason he would brand his conspiracy. "You said he had a book." Chaska's eyes widened, the memory returning. "Not just powder. In the hut a chest, a small one, painted red. It was open when they brought me in." He described what he saw inside, his voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. It wasn't just a book. It was a ledger, bound in dirty, pliable deerskin. "I saw names," he said, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall the script he'd only glanced at. "I saw Pike." Marin's blood, which had been sluggish with cold, now ran hot with dread. Deputy Orrin Pike, the man who wore a badge in the town of Redemption, the man whose job it was to stop the very things Chaska was describing, the man who had ridden with Cutter to her door. He was marking the book. Chaska continued. "Cutter's man, the one who hit me, he pressed his thumb in ink and put it next to a line of writing." Pike laughed. "A ledger of bribes, a record of loyalty sealed in ink." "There was another name," the boy said, struggling. "Grigg." Miles Grigg, the sour-faced owner of the Red Dog Saloon, the only place in town that stank more of despair than it did of whiskey. Marin felt the pieces of the puzzle sliding into place, forming a dark, ugly picture. Pike signs the papers. Marin thought aloud, her mind racing. Grigg orders saloon supplies, crates of whiskey and beer from the east, but the crates are heavy, too heavy. They don't clink. "Black powder," Chaska whispered, "and fuses, hidden under the bottles." Cutter paid Grigg, who falsified the manifests. Pike used his badge to wave the wagons through without inspection. They were arming the northern camp, or Cutter's own rangers, using the saloon as a front and the law as a shield. The deerskin ledger was the proof. It would have the dates, the payments, the shipments, and, Chaska added. He saw Pike point to a list of names under the heading Schedule. Marin knew, with chilling certainty, what that schedule was for. The Hollis Farm, the Boyd Barn. If that ledger was exposed, the entire conspiracy would collapse. Pike would hang. Grigg would be ruined. And even Cutter would be vulnerable to federal marshals. But if it remained hidden, Marin knew her name was next on that list. Her neighbors would vanish like smoke, their land absorbed into Cutter's growing empire, and the valley would be his. The decision formed, cold and hard as the ice on the river. She could not wait. She could not run. She had to hit them. Not Cutter's main ranch that was a fortress. She had to hit the weakest link in the chain. "Badger Cut," she said, her voice flat. "The storm is our only chance. They think we're trapped. They think you're dying. They won't expect us to move." She stood up, her body aching but her mind clear. First, the cabin. She found the string of brass sleigh bells that had belonged to Thomas's harness. She ran a thin gut line from the bells, across the porch, and tied it taut to a post, 2 inches above the snow. It was invisible in the gray light. Anyone who came up her steps would announce themselves. She turned to Chaska. "Can you walk?" He nodded, pushing the quilt away. He was shaky, but his eyes were firm. "Good. We need signals. No talking." She held up a flat palm. "This means freeze. Do not breathe. Do not move." He nodded. She balled her fist and tapped her chest. "This means danger. Get behind me." He copied the gesture. She pointed 2 fingers toward her eyes, then at him. "Watch me. Only me." The pre-dawn was a shade of deep, bruised purple. The air was still, the snow having stopped, but the temperature had plummeted. The world was encased in ice. Marin pulled on her thickest wool coat and Thomas's oversized boots. She gave Chaska a pair of her own spare socks to wrap his hands. She carried the unlit lantern and her heavy, double-barreled shotgun, though she prayed she wouldn't have to use it. Chaska, moving with a pained stiffness, had retrieved his small hatchet. They did not take the path. They slipped out the back of the cabin, down into the deep, frozen irrigation ditch that ran along her property line. It was a shallow trench, but deep enough, filled with drifted snow that muffled their steps. They moved like ghosts in a gray world. The snow that had been their enemy was now their ally, covering their tracks almost as soon as they made them. It was a mile to Badger Cut. Every step was an agony of cold. Marin's lungs burned. Chaska's breath came in ragged, painful gasps. But he never slowed, never complained. He was, she realized, as strong as the winter itself. They saw the hut, a dark square against the white hillside, exactly as he'd described it. It sagged, half buried in a drift, looking derelict and forgotten. No smoke rose from its chimney. No horses were tethered outside. From the bank of the river, Marin could just make out the dark, hook-like sea carved into the crossbeam above the door. They crept forward, Marin first, shotgun raised. The door was barred from the inside. She cursed silently. Chaska tugged on her sleeve, pointing to the side. A single small window, its glass long gone, was covered by a rotting piece of burlap. Marin used the barrel of her shotgun to pry the frozen cloth away. The opening was small, but large enough. She listened, holding her breath. Nothing, only the faint drip of an icicle. She slid her shotgun through the opening first, then hoisted herself up and over, landing softly on the packed dirt floor inside. Chaska followed, as silent as her shadow. The smell hit her instantly. It was not the simple mildew of an abandoned shack. It was the sharp, metallic tang of sulfur, the chemical smell of gun oil, and the waxy scent of oilcloth. Marin struck a match. The flare was deafeningly loud in the small space. She lit her lantern, keeping the shutters turned low, casting only a small, trembling circle of light. They were in an arsenal. Crates were stacked to the low ceiling. Barrels marked with a skull and crossbones, the black powder, were lined against the far wall. Rifles, still coated in factory grease, were piled on a table. Chaska moved past her, his bare feet making no sound. He pointed to the corner. There! A small, heavy-looking chest sat on the floor, its red paint chipped and dark. A thick padlock secured it. Marin set the lantern down and moved toward it, examining the lock. It was cheap. She could probably shoot it off, but the sound would bring the whole valley down on them. It was then she heard it, the crunch of boots in deep snow. Voices. Damn this cold. Pike's gone crazy, making us check this twice. He's spooked by that alderwoman. Says she's got ice in her veins. Just check the powder and let's get back to the Red Dog. Marin's hand moved in a single, fluid motion. Snapping the lantern's metal shutter closed, the hut plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the faint gray rectangle of the window. She grabbed Chaska's arm and pulled him back, down behind a tall stack of flour sacks. Palm flat, freeze! A key scraped in the heavy padlock on the outside. The bar was lifted. The door swung open, flooding the room with the cold, gray light of dawn. Two men entered, stamping snow from their boots. The first was a thick-bodied man Marin didn't recognize, holding a pine knot torch that smoked and hissed. The second man, his face pinched and mean in the torchlight, was Deputy Orrin Pike. What a waste of time, Pike grumbled. He stomped into the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the stores. Marin held her breath. She could feel Chaska pressed against her back, trembling, but silent. They were trapped. Pike and his man were between them and the door. Pike's heavy boots scraped and creaked on the wooden floorboards. The sound amplified in the stillness. He was moving closer. Marin could smell the sour whiskey on his breath, the wet wool of his coat. He stopped, so close that she could have reached through the gap in the sacks and touched his leg. She saw his boot, scarred and muddy. She squeezed Chaska's hand so hard her knuckles ached. Don't move. Don't breathe. Looks dry, the torchbearer said, tapping one of the barrels. It'd better be, Pike sneered. He kicked the small red chest. All this trouble for Cutter's bookkeeping. Stupid. Why don't we just take it to your office? And have the sheriff find it? You're an idiot. Silas, it stays here. Now grab that other lantern. I want to check the fuses. Pike and Silas turned their backs, moving deeper into the shadows of the hut, toward the barrels. This was it. It was the only chance they would have. Marin waited. 1 second, 2. As if on cue, a sudden, violent gust of wind, the last gasp of the dying storm, swept down the river cut. It hit the hut, rattling the loose timbers. The heavy door, which Pike had left unlatched, was caught by the draft and slammed shut with a bang that echoed like a gunshot. "Damn it!" Pike yelled, spinning around, startled by the noise. "Now," Marin whispered. She didn't run for the door. She ran for the window, but not before she grabbed the handle of the small red chest. It was heavier than she expected. As she lunged, her oversized boot caught the leg of an old, rickety ladder propped against the wall. It didn't fall, but it scraped loudly against the timber. "What was that?" Silas shouted, raising his torch. The light swung across the room, catching them. There by the window, it's the woman and the boy. Pike's reaction was faster. He didn't speak. He drew his revolver. "Stop." Marin shoved Chaska toward the opening. Go! A gun exploded in the confined space. The sound was a physical blow, deafening, the flash of the muzzle a blinding orange flower. Splinters erupted from the window frame, one of them slicing Marin's cheek. She threw the heavy chest out into the snowdrift. Chaska scrambled through the opening, disappearing. "She's got the ledger," Pike roared, realizing what she held. Marin dove headfirst through the window, rolling as she hit the deep snow, her hand landing on the chest. Run. Chaska to the river. They were on the steep, icy embankment. Another shot rang out from the hut. The bullet zipped past Marin's ear with a terrifying, intimate hiss. She grabbed the chest and didn't try to run. She fell, pulling Chaska with her. They tumbled and slid, half falling, half rolling down the frozen slope, snow and ice spraying around them. A third shot. This one tore through the thick sleeve of her coat, a line of fire searing her arm. They hit the frozen surface of the silver thread hard, the ice groaning under their weight. "Don't let them get away," Pike was shouting from the window, his voice distorted with fury. Marin scrambled to her feet, pulling Chaska up. They ran, ducking low, using the high riverbank as cover. They were exposed, a mile from home, and the sun was rising on a world that was bright, white, and lethal. But clutched in her numb hand, Marin Alder held the deerskin ledger. She held the conspiracy. The runback was a blur of white agony. The cold air tore at Marin's lungs, and the adrenaline that had fueled her dive through the window was draining away, leaving a deep, throbbing ache in her arm where the bullet had grazed her. It wasn't a clean wound. The lead had ripped through the heavy wool of her coat and her shirt beneath, scoring a hot, bloody line along her flesh. But she didn't slow. She held the iron handle of the small red chest in her good hand, its weight a terrible, vital anchor. Chaska ran beside her, his small legs pumping, his breathing a ragged whistle in the frozen air. They didn't speak. There was no breath to spare. They fled along the frozen riverbank, using the high snow-drifted berm as cover, their hearts pounding in sync with the phantom echo of Pike's gunshots. Every crack of a frozen branch, every rush of wind through the pines, sounded like another pursuer. When they finally staggered back into the cabin, Marin didn't pause to catch her breath. She slammed the door and threw the heavy bar, the sound a definitive thud of temporary safety. Chaska collapsed onto the bearskin rug, his chest heaving, his body racked with a combination of exertion, cold, and the fever she knew was still burning in him. Marin dropped the red chest onto the floor. Her first instinct was to tend to the boy, but the ledger was a burning coal in her hand. She had to know. She had to see the proof she had almost died for. She pushed the heavy oaken table aside, revealing the loose floorboard Thomas had always meant to fix. It was her secret place, where she kept her small savings and her marriage papers. She lifted the plank. Instead of hiding the chest, she pulled out a short, sturdy crowbar. The lock on the chest was cheap, just as she'd thought. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the hasp and put all her weight on it. The metal shrieked in protest, then snapped with a loud crack. She paused, her hand hovering over the lid. Her breathing was shallow, She opened it. There was no gold, no currency, just paper. At the top lay a stack of blank deeds and land transfer forms, all of them neatly bundled, waiting. Beneath them was what she was looking for, bound in supple, dark deerskin. The ledger felt almost alive in her hands, oily and sinister. She untied the leather thong and opened it on the table. The light from the single window was gray and weak, but it was enough. The pages were filled with a neat, looping script, dates, names, figures. "Here," she murmured, her finger tracing a line. October 14th, payment to M. Grigg, saloon supplies, 4 crates. Then, beside it, a separate entry, delivery to North Camp, gifts. She turned the page. November 1st, action, Hollis Farm, 2 barrels. Beside this entry, in a different, scratchier hand, was a simple, chilling note, barn only, no occupants, and pressed into the margin, a greasy, unmistakable thumbprint. Chaska had pulled himself up. He leaned against the table, his knuckles white. "Pike," he whispered, pointing at the scratchy handwriting. Marin nodded. His signature. She flipped to the back of the book. There, on the last page, was a list of names under the heading Properties for Acquisition. She scanned down the list. Hollis, Boyd, Kincaid, and then, near the bottom, Alder. In the very center of the page, as if claiming ownership of the entire scheme, was a brand, burned into the deerskin itself. It wasn't a signature, it was the same hooked C that was carved into the beam at Badger Cut. Ephraim Cutter's mark. She ran her finger over the branded leather. This was the map of his greed. This was the proof that the Indian raids were a lie, a calculated campaign of terror designed to break the settlers of Sagebrush Bend and steal their land. She looked at Chaska. He was staring at the list of names, his face pale. She read one of the entries aloud, her voice hard as iron. November 5th, target Ansel Boyd, location West Pasture Creek, method fire, powder 1 barrel, payment. She recited the sum. Chaska's shoulders slumped. He turned away from the table, a wave of shame washing over him. "I showed them the way," he choked out, his voice thick with guilt. "To the Boyd farm, I showed them the creek. I know the paths, all the hidden ways." He looked at his own hands as if they were traitors. "I drew them a map in the dirt. Before I knew, before the powder. I drew it so they would not harm me." Marin closed the ledger. The sound of the deerskin cover flapping shut was soft, but final. She walked over to the boy, who refused to meet her eyes. She stood for a moment, the throbbing in her arm a dull, persistent reminder of the violence they had just escaped. Then, gently, she placed her good hand on his shoulder. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "A map is just a map. Chaska," she said, her voice softer now, the iron melting away. "It's a piece of paper. It's the land. It isn't good or bad. It's just the truth." She gave his shoulder a small squeeze. "Bad people using the truth doesn't make the truth bad. Your knowledge, that isn't the crime. The crime is in that book." He looked up at her then, his dark eyes searching hers, desperately wanting to believe. "Now," she said, her tone shifting to one of brisk efficiency. "Let's look at you." The fever was still high. His skin was hot to the touch, but he was shivering again. And she realized, was bleeding. She slid the ledger back under the floorboard and replaced the plank. The cabin was their fortress again, and they were its wounded defenders. She peeled off her heavy coat. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the wool and the muslin of her sleeve. The wound beneath was a raw, red line, bleeding sluggishly. It was a graze, painful and deep, but the lead had not stayed. She was lucky. She washed it with the last of Jedediah's whiskey, biting down hard on a strip of leather to keep from crying out. The sting was a fire that made her eyes water, but it was a clean fire. She bandaged it tightly with a strip of clean linen. Then she turned to Chaska. She sat him down by the hearth, which she fed with fresh logs until it cast a bright, warm glow. She went to her herb cabinet, a small set of drawers Thomas had built for her. She pulled out dried willow bark for the fever, and yarrow to clean the stitched wound on his head. She boiled them in the kettle, the steam filling the small cabin with the sharp, clean scent of the prairie. She brought him the mug. "Drink, it's bitter, but it will help." He took it without protest, sipping the hot, bitter tea. The warmth and the medicine began to work, his shivering subsiding, the tension draining from his small frame. He looked exhausted, older than any child should ever look. Marin sat on the floor beside him, leaning her back against the wall, her shotgun resting within easy reach. The cabin was quiet. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the steady drip, drip, drip from the roof. The thaw had begun. The snow was melting. "The tree outside the window," Marin said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, conversational, as if they were just two neighbors sharing a fire. Chaska looked toward the window. "My husband, Thomas. He planted that apple tree the year we built this cabin, carried the sapling all the way from Ohio, said a man needed roots, and so did his farm." She smiled, a small, sad movement of her lips. "It was just a stick for the longest time. I yelled at it, I watered it, I threatened it. For 3 years, nothing, just leaves." She stared into the flames, seeing the memory there. Thomas used to laugh. He'd say, "It's biding its time, Marin, it's waiting till it's ready." He never saw it. She looked at Chaska. "This autumn it finally gave fruit. Just one perfect red apple. I picked it last month. It's in the cellar." She didn't know why she was telling him this. Perhaps to remind herself that things did, eventually, grow. That waiting wasn't the same as defeat. Chaska said nothing, but he watched her, his eyes following the play of the firelight on her face. He finished the tea and set the mug down. He was warm. Finally. The cabin, the fire, the story, it was the first real safety he had known in days. He was still a child, and the weight of what he had seen, what he had done, and what had been done to him, was too much to carry alone. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned his head sideways, just enough to rest against the thick wool of her sleeve, on her uninjured arm. It was a small, tentative gesture, a silent request for comfort. Marin stiffened, surprised by the contact. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with simple, trusting affection. Then she relaxed. She took the heavy quilt from her bed and draped it over his shoulders, tucking it in around him. He gave a small sigh, a sound of profound weariness, and his eyes drifted shut. Marin sat there, unmoving, for a long time. She listened to the boy's breathing deepen, becoming the even, rhythmic breath of true sleep. She listened to the meltwater dripping from the roof, a sound that promised an end to the snow, but also, she knew, the return of her enemies. The roads would be passable by morning. Later that night, long after Chaska had fallen into a deep, fever-healed sleep on the rug, Marin sat at the table, by the light of a single tallow candle. She sharpened a quill. She pulled out her last good sheet of paper and the ink pot. She had the proof, but the proof was useless if she was the only one who knew it. She couldn't fight Cutter and Pike alone. She needed the town. But the town was afraid. She thought of the faces in Redemption, the shopkeeper who looked away when Pike walked in, the blacksmith who suddenly had no time to repair the wagon of a man who'd argued with Cutter. They were good people, but they were cowed. All except one. She dipped the pen. Reverend Pruitt. Reverend Alden Pruitt was a thin man with a voice like a trumpet, the only man in the valley who had ever, in living memory, dared to contradict Ephraim Cutter. He had preached a sermon on greed, staring directly at Cutter's front row pew. That was still whispered about. He was a man of firm, unbending moral principle. He would not be afraid. She wrote, her hand swift and sure. She told him of the ledger. She told him of the plot to set the settlers against the Sioux. She told him she had proof of the arson, proof that would implicate Pike and Grigg. She begged him to rally the good, quiet men of the town, the ones whose fear was less than their decency. She needed witnesses. She needed a jury of their peers, not a corrupt deputy. She signed her name, folded the letter, and sealed it with wax. She would give it to Jedediah, the mail rider, at first light. The next morning, the world was a dripping, muddy mess. The great white silence had been replaced by the sound of gushing water. Marin's tripwire bells were sagging, the line heavy with wet snow. Chaska's fever had broken. His eyes were clear, and he ate the small bowl of oatmeal she gave him with a hunger that was a relief to see. Marin waited by the door, her heart a tight knot of anticipation. She heard the plodding hoofbeats of Jedediah's mule before she saw him. He was a lanky man, his face weathered to leather by the sun and wind. "Mornin', Miss Alder," he called, his voice cheerful. "Looks like the world thawed out. Got a letter for the Reverend. You say—" She handed it to him. "It's urgent. Jed, more urgent than you know." Jedediah's easy smile faded as he saw the gravity in her eyes. He saw the new, raw-looking stitches on Chaska's head, the boy standing silently in the shadow of the doorway. He saw the dark, ripped wool on Marin's sleeve and the dried bloodstain near the cuff. "Trouble," he stated, not asking. "The kind that book learning won't fix," Marin replied. "Please, just get it to him. He'll have it before noon." Jedediah promised. He tipped his hat and nudged his mule back into the muddy track. The wait was the hardest part. The hours crawled. Marin and Chaska worked, reinforcing the cabin. They brought in the last of the dry wood. Marin cleaned and reloaded her shotgun. Chaska, his strength returning, proved to have a keen eye, sharpening her spare axe until it had a razor edge. They were a silent, efficient team. It was nearly dusk when Marin heard the mule return. Her heart leaped. Jedediah wasn't due back for 2 days. This was it. This was the answer. She ran to the door. Jedediah didn't dismount. His face was grim, his usual cheer gone, replaced by a deep, troubled fear. I couldn't deliver it. Ms. Alder," he said, holding the letter out to her. "What, is he ill?" "He's gone." Jedediah wouldn't meet her eyes. "Packed up, his horse, his bags, all of it. The whole parsonage is empty. Happened last night, they say." "Gone." Marin felt the blood drain from her face. "Gone where?" "Just gone," Jedediah said, his voice dropping. "There's talk in town. 2 of Cutter's men paid him a visit after dark. Just a friendly chat. They called it, and this morning he was gone. Left sudden like. No goodbye, no word to his congregation. Just gone." Threatened, silenced, driven out, the one man she thought would stand, the one voice that could rally the town, had been removed from the board. Marin took the letter back. The wax seal was unbroken. It felt as heavy as a stone. She looked at Jedediah, and he looked at her. He knew, without reading a word, that she was in a danger he could not help her with. "Be careful, Marin," he said softly. "The ridges have eyes, and Cutter, he owns 'em all." He turned his mule and rode away, fast, as if fleeing the shadow that now clung to her cabin. Marin stood on the porch, the useless letter in her hand. The cold, hard truth settled over her. The hope she had allowed herself to feel curdled into a hard knot in her stomach. No one is coming. Pruitt was gone. The town was terrified. The law was corrupt. She looked at Chaska, who had heard everything from the doorway. They were alone. She closed the door and barred it. She walked to the fire and threw the letter into the flames. She watched the paper curl and blacken, her last hope turning to ash. "All right," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "They want a fight. They'll have one." She turned to Chaska. Her face was set, as hard and unyielding as the land itself. I will not run from my own home. I will make my own way. She went to her sewing box and took out the string of black stones Tate Ironcloud had given her. She had held them for protection, but they weren't for her. They were for him. She pressed the cold, smooth beads into Chaska's hand. This is yours. Your uncle gave it to me. Chaska's eyes widened. He recognized the stones. He said to show them to someone who would understand. Marin said, I'm giving them back to you. The thaw is here. The roads are open. You need to go. You're not safe here. I've made it worse. Chaska closed his small hand around the beads, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the dusk. It was faint, a tiny, metallic jingle. Marin froze. The sleigh bells, the tripwire on the porch. She grabbed the shotgun. Chaska snatched his hatchet. They moved to the wall beside the door, backs flat against the logs. They waited. A shadow fell across the window. Then, a low, desperate groan. It was not the confident tread of Pike or the heavy step of Cutter's men. It was a stumble. Knock-knock scrape. A fumbling, weak sound. Marin motioned for Chaska to stay back. She held the shotgun with her good arm, the barrel aimed at the door. Who's there? Please? A man's voice cracked. Ms. Alder, it's Ansel Boyd. Please, they burned everything. My wife, she's at her sister's in Redemption. I got nowhere to go. It's so cold. Marin's heart clenched. Ansel Boyd. His name was on the ledger. She lowered the bar and opened the door a crack. He was a wreck, a tall, thin man, now stooped, his coat singed, his face black with soot. His eyes were wide with terror and grief. He wasn't a threat. He was a victim. He was the living proof from her ledger. Get in, she said, pulling him inside. Ansel stumbled toward the fire, his hands outstretched, shaking so badly he could barely stand. They came out of nowhere. Fire the horses. Oh, God, the horses. Marin poured him a cup of water, her mind racing. He was another mouth to feed, another life to protect, but he was also a witness. As Ansel raised the tin cup to his lips, his shaking hand paused. His gaze had fixed on something on the table. Maria had forgotten it. The rust-colored iron nail. The one Ephraim Cutter had left on her doorframe. His calling card. His threat. Ansel Boyd's eyes locked onto it. He recognized the unusual shape. His face, already pale beneath the soot, turned a deathly shade of white. He had seen one just like it, he whispered, left in the ashes of his barn. He looked up at Marin, his eyes filled with a new, dawning horror. He wasn't safe. He had fled one fire and run straight into the next. He began to tremble, a deep, bone-rattling fear that had nothing to do with the cold. It's him, he whispered. It's Cutter. He's coming for all of us. The arrival of Ansel Boyd was like a stone dropped into a still, dark pond. The ripples of his terror spread through the small cabin, making the air thick with a new, immediate dread. He was the embodiment of the ledger's cold script, a ghost of fire and loss sent to their doorstep. He huddled by the fire, wrapped in one of Thomas's old blankets, and told his story in a broken, trembling whisper. It was the same story written in Pike's scratchy hand, the sudden shout in the night, the smell of kerosene, the roar as the dry timbers of his barn and his life's work went up in a sheet of orange flame. His fear was a contagion. It settled on Marin not as panic, but as a cold, heavy certainty. The time for waiting was over. The time for hiding was past. They had the proof, but proof was only as strong as the person who wielded it. And right now, she was one woman, a wounded boy, and a terrified farmer against an army. The final confirmation came, as it always did, with the plodding hoofbeats of Jedediah's mule. The mail rider didn't stop for coffee this time. He reined in his mule 20 yards from the porch, his face pale and drawn. Marin, he called out, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to hide. I shouldn't be here, but folks said you ought to know. Know what? Jed Marin asked. stepping out onto the porch, her shotgun held loosely in her good arm. "Cutter, he's gathering men down at Deadwater Ford. Not his usual hands. These are hard men. Riders from out of the territory. 10, maybe 12 of them. They're drinking at the crossing, checking their guns. The talk is they're coming here tonight." He swallowed hard. "Not for a chat. Marin, they're coming to settle a matter of a thief. They're coming for the boy. And for the ledger, and for her." Jedediah didn't have to say it. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice steady. "You've done enough. Now ride, and don't look back." He didn't need to be told twice. He spurred his mule into a clumsy trot, disappearing into the muddy twilight. Marin turned and went back inside. The two men looked at her, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Ansel Boyd's eyes were wide with a fresh wave of panic. Chaska's were narrow, his small hand resting on the handle of his hatchet. He was no longer just a boy she was protecting. He was a fellow soldier in a war they were about to lose. "He's coming," Marin said, her voice flat. There was no room for emotion now. Emotion was a luxury, a weakness. "We can't outrun them. This cabin, this is where we make our stand." For the next hour, she worked with a fierce, focused energy. The farm was not a fortress, but it had its strengths. She knew every inch of it, every shadow, every loose board. That was her advantage. "Ansel, Chaska," she commanded, her voice sharp, cutting through Boyd's fearful paralysis. "Down to the cellar, now!" "But," Ms. Alder Ansel began, wringing his hands, "we should fight. I can—" "You'll do more good staying alive and out of the way." She cut him off, not unkindly. "Cutter wants the boy, and he wants whatever he thinks I have. You are a witness. Your survival is a weapon against him later. If anything happens to me, you get to redemption and you tell the sheriff the real one. Not Pike what you saw. You tell him about the nail." She pointed to the rusted spike still sitting on the table. "You are the proof." She guided them to the trapdoor. "Stay here. Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, if I come back, I will knock 3 times, then once, then twice, 3, 1, 2. Do you understand?" They both nodded, their faces grim. She lowered them into the damp, earthy darkness and slid the heavy crate back over the door. They were safe. For now. Next, the defenses. She took a can of linseed oil from the small barn, the stuff she used to treat the wagon wheels. She went out onto the front porch and poured it in a wide, slick arc in front of the door. The dark, viscous liquid soaked into the wood, nearly invisible in the gloom. It would be slippery as ice, and the fumes, if they met a spark, would create a thick, choking cloud of smoke. She went to the side of the barn, to the place where the shadows were deepest. There lay an old, broken ladder, one of its rungs rotted through. Thomas had meant to burn it. Instead, she dragged it and laid it flat in the muddy path, right where men seeking cover by the corner of the barn would run. A simple trip, a moment's confusion, was all she hoped for. Her final preparation was the deadliest. In a locked chest under her bed was Thomas's old hunting crossbow. It was heavy, powerful, and slow to load, but it was silent. She took it out, her hands moving with a sureness that surprised her. She propped it on the sill of the small window that faced the porch, aiming it not at the door, but at the thick wooden post that supported the porch roof. She tied a thin, strong piece of fishing line to the trigger mechanism. She ran the line down the wall, out a small hole near the floor, and stretched it taut across the porch steps, tying it to the same post that held her sleigh bells. The line was a ghost, an invisible threat in the darkness. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to be a message. She was ready. She took up her position in the deep shadows beside the door, her sawn-off shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. The weapon was short, brutal, and meant for close, desperate work. She checked the shells. Double-aught buck. She was not planning to miss. She waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye. Every creak of the cooling timbers, every skittering sound from the mice in the walls, made her heart jump. Then she heard it, a distant sound, carried on the night air. The jingle of harness, the low thud of many hooves on the muddy ground. They were coming. She watched through a crack in the window shutter. At first, they were just a series of bobbing lights in the distance, but they grew, resolving into a column of riders. Torches, held high, guttered in the breeze, casting a sinister, moving glow. The procession looked like a great, fiery serpent winding its way through the darkness, coming straight for her home. They reined in their horses in her yard, a dozen of them, forming a grim, silent semicircle around the cabin. These were not the farm hands she had seen with Cutter before. These were hired guns, their faces hard and shadowed beneath the brims of their hats. Ephraim, Cutter, and Deputy Pike dismounted and walked toward the porch. Pike held up a piece of paper, his chest puffed out with a false sense of authority. "Marin Alder," he bellowed. "In the name of the Territorial Authority of Redemption County, I have a warrant here to search these premises for a fugitive from the law and for stolen property." From her vantage point, Marin could see the official seal at the bottom of the page. It was a blurry, lopsided ink smudge, nothing like the crisp seal on her own deed. He had manufactured it himself. Marin took a deep, steadying breath. She walked to the door, lifted the bar, and opened it. She stood in the doorway, the shotgun held casually, its twin muzzles pointed at the floor. But her hand was firm on the stock, her finger near the trigger. "Evening, Deputy," she said, her voice cool and even. "That's a mighty impressive piece of paper, but I have a law of my own. The first man who brings a torch onto my porch or through that door is committing attempted arson, and I will defend my home against it." A low chuckle ran through the assembled riders. Pike's face flushed with anger. "This is official business. Woman, now stand aside." One of the riders, a large man with a brutal, sneering face, decided to test her. "She's bluffing," he slurred, and took a step toward the porch, raising his torch. His boot hit the tripwire. The sound was not loud. A soft thwump from the window, a whistle of air, and then a solid thud. The man froze, his torch held aloft. The sneer on his face was replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Quivering in the porch post, not 3 inches from his head, was a heavy crossbow bolt. It had struck with such force that the fletching was still vibrating. The sudden gust of its passing had extinguished his torch, leaving him in darkness. The laughter from the other men died instantly, replaced by a string of muttered curses. She wasn't bluffing. Cutter, who had been watching from the bottom of the steps, now moved forward. He raised a hand, and his men fell silent. He looked at Marin, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. He was not intimidated. He seemed almost amused. "Well played, Mrs. Alder," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "You have grit, I'll give you that, but you've made a fatal miscalculation." He took a step closer, his pale eyes pinning her. "You are alone. You have a few clever traps, and 1 shot in that scattergun. I have 12 men. You cannot win this game, so give me the boy, and give me what you stole from my property, and I will let you walk away from this farm with your life." It was the moment of truth. The weight of the 12 silent, armed men, the utter finality in Cutter's voice, pressed in on her. She felt the isolation, the hopelessness of her stand. She was alone. And then, she wasn't. It came from the direction of the river, a long, clear, piercing whistle. It was not a bird. It was not a man. It was a signal. Cutter's head snapped around. His men, who had been focused on Marin, now shifted uneasily in their saddles, their eyes scanning the dark tree line behind them. Out of the darkness, 3 figures emerged. They were on horseback, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly unlike the clumsy plodding of Cutter's thugs. They were silhouettes, dark shapes against the star-dusted sky, their forms indistinct but their purpose clear. They moved to the edge of the clearing, positioning themselves directly behind Cutter's posse. They were trapped. Cutter and his men were now caught in a pincer, between the defiant woman in the cabin and the three silent, unknown riders at their backs. Cutter's smooth composure finally cracked. A flicker of uncertainty, of animal caution, crossed his face. He didn't know who these newcomers were. They could be lawmen, they could be rival ranchers, they could be Sioux warriors. To open fire now would be to invite a bullet from an unknown quarter. One of the riders, the one in the center, slowly raised a hand to his neck. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In the faint starlight, Marin saw it. A string of polished black stones, the necklace of Tate Iron Cloud. He wasn't showing it to Cutter. He was showing it to her. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over Marin. She was not alone. She had been watched over. She gave the barest, almost imperceptible nod. The message was received. Cutter saw the silent exchange. He saw the shift in Marin's posture, the steel returning to her spine. He knew he had lost the moment. The tactical advantage was gone, replaced by a dangerous, unpredictable stalemate. He let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound of pure frustration. He backed away from the porch, his eyes never leaving Marin's face. "It seems you have friends, Mrs. Alder," he snarled, the pleasant baritone gone, replaced by a raw, venomous rasp. "It doesn't matter. This changes nothing." He turned to his men. "Back to the ford. We're done for tonight." He swung himself into his saddle, his movements stiff with fury. He pointed a finger at Marin, a gesture that was both a promise and a curse. "This isn't over. I'll be back at dawn, and I'll have real papers then, papers that say this land is mine, and I will tear this house down to the foundations to find what belongs to me." He wheeled his horse around and, with his men, galloped back into the darkness, their angry shouts and the thunder of their hooves fading into the night. Marin stood in the doorway, her shotgun still held at the ready, until the last sound was gone. The three silent riders at the edge of the woods seemed to melt back into the shadows, disappearing as quietly as they had arrived. She was alone again, but something had changed. Hope, which had been a distant, flickering candle, was now a steady flame. She closed the door and dropped the heavy bar into place. The sound echoed in the silent cabin. She leaned against the cool wood, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She slid the floorboard aside and pulled out the deerskin ledger, clutching it to her chest. It was her only shield, her only sword. Cutter's threat hung in the air. Dawn. Time was no longer measured in days, or even in hours. It was measured in the few, precious heartbeats she had left until sunrise. The dawn that broke over Sagebrush Bend was not the one Marin had braced for. It came not with the thunder of hooves or the roar of Pike's voice, but with the quiet, insistent drip of the great thaw. The siege had been broken before it began. Tate Iron Cloud's silent presence at her back had been a checkmate. Cutter, faced with an unknown enemy and the damning evidence Marin had stolen, had chosen the smarter path. He had not returned. In that fragile, muddy dawn, Marin had made her choices. She gave Ansel Boyd her second-best mule and a pouch of dried jerky, pointing him toward the sheriff's office in the next county. Far from redemption's corrupted law, he had wept with gratitude, his spirit broken, and disappeared over the ridge. She never saw him again. Her goodbye with Chaska was different. It was fast, hard, and wordless. She'd given him back the string of black beads and a small sack of food. She pointed to the river, then to the mountains where she knew his people ranged. He looked at her, his dark eyes the eyes of a man, not a boy filled with a debt he could not voice. Then he turned and ran, vanishing into the willows by the silver thread, a small ghost reclaiming his own world. She had stood on the porch, the deerskin ledger heavy in her hand, and watched the valley steam in the new light. The immediate threat was gone, but the war had just begun. Cutter would not use fire and lead again. It was too loud, too messy. He would use the one thing she could not fight: time. 13 years. 13 years of snow melting into rain, and rain swelling the creeks, and the creeks feeding the crops. 13 years of the sun turning the high prairie grass from green to gold and back to winter's gray. The wind and the ice had torn at the cabin, and Marin had fought back. She replaced the leaking shingles on the roof, nailing each one down with a grim, solitary rhythm. She mended the fence where the blizzard had snapped the posts. She rebuilt the collapsed corner of the barn, her muscles hardening, her skin turning to leather. Thomas's apple tree, the one she had cursed as a barren stick, finally surrendered. It thrived. It grew tall, its branches reaching wide, and every autumn it hung heavy with perfect, red fruit. It was a victory, but a silent one. The cabin was stronger than the day it was built, the farm more productive, but it was a fortress for one. Sagebrush Bend, however, shrank. The valley emptied, life draining from it like water from a cracked basin. The war of attrition that Cutter began was slow, invisible, and absolute. The Hollis family, whose farm lay 2 miles upstream, found their well had turned brackish. A dead coyote, they said, must have fallen in. But when they dug a new well, it too came up sour. They sold their land to a development company with an office in Redemption, an office that paid in cash and whose deeds were filed by Orrin Pike. The Kincaid Ranch, south of the river, woke one July to find their irrigation ditch bone dry. Cutter's men, working 2 miles upstream on his own property, had shored up a bank, conveniently and permanently diverting the creek's main flow onto his own vast pastures. The Kincaids fought him in Pike's courtroom and were buried in legal fees and lost filings. They lasted 2 seasons before they, too, were forced to sell for pennies on the dollar. There were no more midnight raids, no more gunshots, just the quiet, relentless pressure of misfortune. A lost shipment of seed, a sudden outbreak of cattle sickness that, strangely, never crossed the new barbed wire fences on Cormorant Ridge. A threatening letter, composed of words cut from the Eastern Gazette, left on a doorstep. The good people, the ones Marin had hoped Reverend Pruitt would rally, bled away. They were farmers, not soldiers. They came to this land for peace, not a permanent siege. Ansel Boyd's name was just the first to be struck from the ledger at the Redemption post office. Marin would stand by the window, picking up her rare mail, and watch as the roster of her neighbors grew shorter. Kincaid, Hollis, Marsh, Boyd, their names, painted in neat black letters on the wooden slots, were scraped away, leaving pale, blank wood, like tombstones being erased. Soon, only one name remained on that lonely stretch of the valley road alder. While the valley withered, Ephraim Cutter bloomed. He had laundered his reputation as carefully as he laundered his land titles. The ruthless cattle baron was gone, replaced by the public benefactor. When the old church burned down, another accident, this one blamed on faulty wiring. It was Ephraim Cutter who donated the timber and the stained glass for the new Redemption Chapel. His initials, E.C., were carved into the cornerstone. When the schoolhouse needed a new roof and a new teacher, it was the Cutter Educational Fund that provided. He owned the bank. He held the mortgage on the general store. He no longer needed to use force. He used debt. He used dependency. His fortress on Cormorant Ridge reflected his new status. It was no longer a simple ranch house. It was a compound. The split rail fences were gone, replaced by the vicious, gleaming invention of barbed wire, stretching for miles. And on the highest peak, overlooking the entire valley, he built a stone watchtower. He said it was to spot fires. Marin knew it was to watch her. And Orrin Pike, once a thuggish deputy, now wore a star. He was acting Marshal Pike, his vest fuller, his watch chain heavier. He administered Cutter's Law, the new, clean, unassailable law of foreclosure and property disputes. Marin Alder endured. The 13 years had carved their own map onto her face. Her dark hair was threaded with streaks of silver, pulled back in the same tight, practical bun. The lines around her eyes were deeper, etched not from laughter, but from 13 years of squinting into the sun, watching the road, waiting. She had learned. Oh, how she had learned. She learned that survival was not a passive act. She took the money from her savings under the floorboard and, through Jedediah, she ordered 2 things. The first was a new rifle, a Winchester repeating rifle, sleek and deadly. She spent her evenings not mending, but practicing. She graduated from shooting bottles on a fence post to shooting the buttons off a coat she'd nailed to a tree. 100 yards away, her hands, once calloused by the plow, were now calloused by the rifle's lever and the trigger. The second thing she ordered was books, not novels. She ordered legal texts. She sat by candlelight, her finger tracing the dense, impenetrable language of land deeds, water rights, and homesteading law. She learned the words that Pike and Cutter used as weapons lien, easement, eminent domain. She learned to read the law so she would recognize the trap when it was finally set for her. And she learned silence. She stopped going to redemption unless it was for salt or powder. She spoke to no one but Jedediah. In town, she was a specter, the Widow Alder, the crazy, stubborn recluse of Sagebrush Bend. The children were warned away from her property. She became a ghost story, which suited her just fine. Ghosts were left alone. But the ledger remained. It was her Bible and her curse. It was still there, under the floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth. The ink faded, but the name still clear. It was a truth that had grown stale, a bomb she could not light. She knew she could not be its only guardian. In the first year, in the dead of winter, she had performed her own desperate ritual. She bought 4 cheap copybooks and, by the light of the fire, she meticulously, painfully, copied every word from the deerskin ledger. Her hand, unused to writing, would cramp and shake, but she persisted. She created 4 copies of the truth. The first, she wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with pine resin. She took it to the small, wind-swept hill where Thomas was buried. She prayed for his forgiveness, then used a shovel to pry up the corner of his heavy granite headstone. She buried the book beneath it, in the cold, safe earth. The second, she took apart, page by page. She went to the back of her cabin, to the old, heavy Bible that had belonged to Thomas's mother, with a small, sharp knife. She sliced open the thick binding, slipping the folded pages of the ledger, one by one, between the stiff backing and the leather cover. She glued it back together, the proof of Cutter's sins hidden within the book of Genesis. The third copy, she placed in a small tin box and took to the edge of the property, where her beehive stood. She placed the box at the very bottom of the oldest, angriest hive. Cutter's men might risk fire, they might risk the law, but they would not risk the bees. The fourth and final copy, she sealed and gave to Jedediah. She paid him double. I don't know where this goes, Jed, but it has to go east, to a federal marshal, a newspaper, someone who isn't owned by Cutter. He had taken it, his face grim, and she never knew if it arrived. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean of indifference. And so the years passed. The farm was secure. The roof was sound. The larder was full. But Marin Alder, for the first time in her life, understood true loneliness. Her heart, which had been broken by grief and then hardened by fear, now felt empty. It was hollowed out, as empty as the post office slots, as empty as the valley. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and cold orange, she sat on the front porch. She ran her hand over the step. Her fingers found a long, jagged crack in the wood, a flaw that had been there for as long as she could remember. She thought of the night of the storm, the night it all began, the night she had found a boy on her woodpile. She had sent him away to save him, but she realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, that he had also saved her. He had given her a reason to fight, a purpose beyond mere stubborn survival, and she had not seen him in 13 years. She closed her eyes, and his face was there, sharp and clear. Not the face of the feverish child, but the memory of his eyes, so dark and clear and steady. If anyone ever comes back, she thought to herself, her hand tightening on the cracked wood. If this long, gray waiting is ever to end, let it be him. Let it be the boy with eyes like the rain-washed night. It was a fool's prayer, and she knew it. A month later, a man she didn't know rode up to her gate. He wasn't one of Pike's men. He was a fur trader, his wagon piled high with pelts, his face weathered and neutral. He was on his way down from the Northern Territories. "Ms. Alder," he called, not dismounting. "I am." "Got a package for you. Was given to me by a Lakota man up near the Powder River. Paid me a silver dollar to see it got to your hand. And your hand only." He reached into his satchel and tossed her a small, greasy leather pouch. Marin caught it. It was heavy. She looked at the trader, but his face was blank. He was just a messenger. He tipped his hat and nudged his mules, his wagon wheels creaking as he continued on toward redemption. Marin loosened the drawstring. Her heart, which had beaten at the same slow, steady pace for 13 years, suddenly hammered against her ribs. She emptied the contents into her palm. A string of polished black beads, identical to the ones she had given Chaska, identical to the ones Tate Ironcloud had worn. They were cold and smooth against her calloused skin. With them was a small, folded piece of birch bark. She unfolded it. It wasn't writing. It was a drawing, a symbol, etched in charcoal. A small butterfly. Beneath it, in simple, clear English, were 5 words. A message from Tate, a promise from the past. "When the butterfly flaps its wings, we will come." Marin Alder closed her hand around the beads, the cold stone biting into her flesh. She looked up, past her apple tree, past the barbed wire of Cutter's domain, to the high, distant ridges. The long, gray waiting was over. The butterfly was ready to flap its wings. The butterfly had flapped its wings. The message on the birch bark was a promise, but it was also a warning. Something was coming. Marin didn't have to wait long to find out what. It started with the smoke. She saw it at dawn, a thick, greasy column of black rising from the east, from the property that had once belonged to the Hollis family. Cutter wasn't just maintaining the land he'd stolen. He was clearing it, burning away the last vestiges of the families he had displaced, scorching the earth to make it his own. The smoke was a signal, a brazen act of ownership visible to the entire valley. It was a message meant for her. The official message arrived an hour later. It wasn't a ragged bounty hunter this time, nor a nervous mail rider. It was a man in a clean suit, riding a fine-looking bay gelding. He looked like a banker from back east, his face clean-shaven and his eyes holding a polite, professional emptiness. He reined in at her gate, refusing to enter the yard, as if her small, stubborn farm was contaminated. "Marin Alder," he called, his voice carrying clearly on the cool morning air. He didn't introduce himself. He was an instrument. Marin came out onto the porch, her Winchester held loosely in one hand, its stock resting against her hip. She did not speak. The man retrieved a crisp white envelope from his inner coat pocket. "I am here on behalf of the Cormorant Ridge Development Corporation. I am authorized to make you a final offer for this parcel of land." He opened the envelope. "The corporation is prepared to pay, in cash, the sum of $2,000, to be delivered at sunset this evening. You will be expected to vacate the premises by that time." $2,000. It was an astronomical sum, enough to buy a dozen farms like this in a sane market. It was, Marin knew, blood money. It was also an ultimatum. "And if I refuse?" Marin's voice was a low rasp. The man in the suit gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "The offer is valid until sunset. After that, he paused, letting the smoke from the Hollis farm finish his sentence for him. After that, the corporation will proceed with its development plans for the valley. This parcel is a key part of that development. It will be acquired. Good day, ma'am. He placed the white envelope on her fence post, a stark contrast to the rusted nail cutter had left all those years ago, and turned his horse. He rode away at a neat, unhurried trot. Marin watched him go. She did not retrieve the envelope. She knew it would contain legal papers, deeds of sale, all of them in order. All of them backed by Pike's star and Cutter's guns. The law she had studied was just another tool in his arsenal. Sunset. He had given her a deadline. He was coming. She spent the day not in panic, but in preparation. She did not pack. She cleaned her rifle, checking the mechanism, chambering each round by hand. She brought fresh water up from the well. She baked a small loaf of cornbread, the simple, domestic act of defiance against the coming chaos. She was not a victim waiting for a raid. She was a homeowner preparing for a property dispute, and she intended to dispute it with every ounce of lead and law she possessed. The sun began its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in the hues of blood and fire. The air grew still. The valley held its breath. And then, just as the first long shadows began to stretch across her yard, they came. They didn't come from the road this time. They came over the ridge, a dark line of riders silhouetted against the dying sun. Not a dozen this time, more. Marin counted 15, then 20. They moved in a wide, arrogant formation, a cavalry of hired guns and foreclosed souls. At their head rode Ephraim Cutter, sitting tall on a magnificent black stallion. Beside him was Marshal Orrin Pike, his star gleaming on his vest. A roll of papers, the real papers he had promised 13 years ago, held in his hand like a scepter. They fanned out in her yard, a silent, intimidating crescent of horses and armed men, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They had come to collect. Cutter dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth of her yard. He walked to the center of the clearing, his long duster coat sweeping behind him. He looked up at her, a smile of absolute, patient victory on his face. "Ms. Alder," he called out, his voice the same smooth, pleasant baritone. "The sun is nearly set. A generous offer was made. I trust you've had time to consider it." Marin stood on the porch, her Winchester now held at her side, muzzle down. "I've considered it, Mr. Cutter. The land is not for sale." Pike spurred his horse forward, unrolling his papers. "Marin Alder, this land has been declared forfeit in lieu of unpaid territorial taxes. We have a writ of seizure. You are trespassing." It was a lie, a final, clumsy forgery of the law, but it was the only one he needed. Cutter raised a hand, silencing Pike. "It doesn't matter," he said, still smiling at Marin. "I gave you the choice. Woman, you chose to be difficult. That's a pity." He turned his head slightly. "Silas, clear the porch." The same large, brutal man who had tried to light his torch all those years ago grinned, his teeth yellow. He swung his leg over his saddle. It was then, in that moment of absolute stillness, that the sound came. Boom, doom, doom. A single, deep-throated drum. It was not a military snare. It was a native drum, its voice the heartbeat of the earth itself. It came from the south, from the direction of the river. Cutter froze, his smile faltering. His men, who had been focused on Marin, turned in their saddles, their hands moving to their holsters. "What in—" Pike began. Boom, doom, doom. It was closer now, and with it came another sound, the sound of water, the sound of many horses, fording the silver thread. From the willows and cottonwoods that lined the riverbank, they emerged, not 3 riders this time, 30 Sioux warriors, moving in a disciplined, silent line. They were not painted for war, but they were armed for it. They carried repeating rifles, war lances, and bows. Their ponies were sleek and fast, and they churned the shallow water of the creek into a silver spray under the setting sun. They fanned out, creating a second, wider crescent. Cutter's men, who had been the hunters, were now the hunted. They were encircled, caught between the cabin and a force that outnumbered them and, Marin knew, outmatched them in skill and spirit. At their head rode a man who sat on his horse as if he were part of it. He was tall, his shoulders broad, his hair long and bound by a simple leather band. He wore no chief's headdress, only a leather war shirt and a look of absolute, unshakable calm. He guided his horse through the line of Cutter's men, who parted for him as if he were a blade. He rode into the center of the yard, stopping not 10 feet from Ephraim Cutter. Marin's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which had been a cold stone of resolve, suddenly felt as if it would crack open. The light was fading, and the man's face was in shadow. But she didn't need to see his features. She saw the way he held his head. She saw the scar. It was a thin, white line, tracing the exact path of the wound she had stitched by firelight 13 years ago. The jagged cut above his left eyebrow. It was Chaska, the boy she had pulled from the snow, the child who had weighed less than a sack of feathers, was gone. In his place was this man. His face was harder, his body powerful, but his eyes, when he turned his head and looked up at her on the porch, his eyes were the same, calm as stone, deep as the night. Chaska Redleaf dismounted. He did not drop his reins, he just let them fall, and his horse stood, as still and solid as its master. He took 3 steps toward Cutter, his movements fluid and deliberate. He stopped, planting his feet in the soil of Marin's yard. His voice, when he spoke, was not the reedy whisper she remembered. It was a deep, resonant baritone that carried over the silent, tense yard. "Ephraim Cutter," he said. It was not a question. It was a judgment. "This land is under the protection of the people. This land is under my protection. Take your men. Leave in peace." Cutter, for the first time in his life, looked genuinely surprised. He recovered quickly, his face darkening with a sudden, hot rage. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Protection law in this valley doesn't belong to you. Boy, it belongs to him." He jabbed a thumb at Pike's star. "I have a writ. This land is mine. Now get your painted friends off my property before I have you all arrested for trespassing and incitement to riot." Several of Cutter's men, emboldened by his voice, drew their rifles from their scabbards behind Chaska in a single, fluid, chilling motion. 30 arrows were knocked onto 30 bowstrings. The hiss of the shafts sliding into place was the only sound. Chaska did not turn. He did not reach for the rifle on his horse or the knife at his belt. His eyes remained fixed on Cutter. Slowly, he raised his hand. He was not drawing a weapon. He was holding something, a string of polished black stones. It was not the string she had given him. It was a third one, identical, a match to the one he had given her, and the one she knew Tate Ironcloud still wore. It was the symbol of the promise, a 3-fold cord that had not been broken by 13 years of silence. Cutter's eyes narrowed. He didn't understand the gesture, but he understood the power behind it. He understood that this was not a random encounter. This was a reckoning. In that moment, Marin moved. She stepped down from the top stair. Her boots hitting the porch, she walked down the remaining steps, her Winchester still held at her side. She didn't stop until she was standing next to Chaska. She did not look at him. She looked at Cutter. She and Chaska stood shoulder to shoulder. They were aligned. They were a wall. In the cold evening air, she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. A solid, living presence. 13 years of solitude and fear dissolved in that single shared breath. Cutter saw it. He saw the woman he thought he had isolated, the lone, crazy widow, standing beside the leader of a war party that had appeared from nowhere. He saw the string of beads in Chaska's hand, and he saw Marin Alder's hand, resting on her own stalk. And he knew, with a sudden, sickening jolt, that she, too, possessed a string of those same black stones. The arrogant flush on his face drained away, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His smile was gone, replaced by the pinched, venomous look of a snake that has been cornered. He had miscalculated. He had believed her to be alone, and he had been disastrously, lethally wrong. He took an involuntary half-step back, his boot heel scraping in the dirt. He looked at Pike, who was frozen, his mouth open, the writ fluttering uselessly in his hand. He looked at his hired guns, who were now looking at the 30 arrows aimed at their chests, their bravado gone. Cutter's composure snapped back, a mask of pure, cold hatred. "This is not over," he hissed, his voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. He pointed a finger, not at Chaska, but at Marin. "You've made your choice. You've allied yourself with them." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We're leaving." "But, Mr. Cutter," Pike stammered. "The writ." "The writ is paper, you fool," Cutter roared, snatching it from Pike's hand and crushing it in his fist. He swung onto his stallion. "Retreat today. Revenge another day." He wheeled the black horse, spurred it viciously, and tore out of the yard, his men scrambling behind him. A disorganized, panicked mob. They fled over the ridge, a cloud of dust rising in their wake. The thunder of their retreat a hollow echo in the newfound quiet. The dust settled. The sun had finally sunk below the horizon, leaving the valley in a deep, peaceful twilight. Chaska's warriors did not move. They sat on their horses, a silent, disciplined ring of guardians. Marin did not move. She continued to look at the empty space where Cutter had been, the tension of 13 years, the adrenaline of the last hour, drained out of her, leaving her trembling, but upright. Chaska turned. He did not move toward her, but his entire focus was on her. The hard lines of the leader, the cold stone of the warrior, softened. The calm returned to his eyes, but it was a different calm now. It was not the stillness of a mountain. It was the stillness of a harbor after a long, violent storm. It was the look he had given her as a boy, over the rim of a tin cup of molasses tea. It was recognition. It was gratitude. "Marin Alder," he said, his voice low. "I promised I would not forget." Marin finally turned her head to look at him. She looked at the man he had become, at the strength he had brought back to her door. Her throat was tight, her heart a storm of emotions she had not allowed herself to feel for more than a decade. She gave a small, shaky nod, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "And I," she whispered, her voice thick, "I live to remember." The silence that descended upon the yard was more profound than any Marin had ever known. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the full, watchful quiet of a sanctuary. The dust settled. The last sliver of the sun vanished, leaving the sky a canvas of deep indigo scattered with the first cold diamonds of the stars. Chaska's warriors remained where they were, a silent, disciplined perimeter, their forms melting into the twilight. They were a living wall, and for the first time in 13 years, Marin felt the weight of her constant vigilance begin to lift. Chaska did not give orders. He simply turned and walked toward the riverbank, a silent invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Marin followed. She left her Winchester leaning against the porch rail, a gesture of trust that felt both momentous and utterly natural. They walked along the muddy edge of the silver thread, the water whispering over the stones. For a long time, they said nothing, simply matching their stride. The quiet space between them filled with the unspoken history of 13 winters. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint, clean smell of the pines on the far ridge. "Tate Ironcloud is an old man now," Chaska said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to blend with the sound of the river. "His eyes are clouded, but his mind is still as sharp as a flint knife. It was he who sent the traitor with the message. He knew Cutter was making his final move. He has been watching this valley, and you, for a long time. And your mother, Marin asked, the question soft. A shadow passed over Chaska's face, a flicker of an old, deep pain. She walked the star path 8 winters ago. The coughing sickness took her. She was a good woman. She would have liked you. They walked on. He told her of the intervening years, not as a grand saga, but as a series of quiet, hard-won seasons. After he had fled her farm, he had found his people, but they were a fractured group, caught between the lies of the northern band and the pressure from the army. He told her how Tate had taken him under his wing, teaching him not just how to hunt and fight, but how to lead, not with a loud voice, but with a quiet certainty. How, over the years, the other young men, the ones who had grown tired of the old chief's pride and Cutter's poison, had begun to look to him. He had not sought leadership, he explained, but it had found him, a heavy blanket he had learned to wear. "We are not a war party," he said, gesturing back toward the silent figures in the yard. "We are a patrol. We keep the peace. We watch the borders of our lands, and we honor our debts." Marin listened, her heart aching with a strange mixture of pride and sorrow for the boyhood he had never truly had. He had been forged in the same fire of hardship that had shaped her. "When I left here," he said, his eyes on the dark, moving water, "I was just a boy running from a fire. Now, I understand the fire was meant for all of us." Marin's own story was shorter, bleaker. She spoke of the valley emptying, of the names disappearing from the post office, of the slow, cold siege of Cutter's Law. As she recounted the story of that first night, of finding him in the snow, of stitching his wound by the light of the hearth, her hand, tucked into the pocket of her coat, unconsciously clenched into a tight fist. The memory was still so sharp, the fear so visceral. Chaska stopped walking. He had seen the small, involuntary movement. He reached out, his own hand large and warm, and gently covered her balled fist, still inside her coat pocket. He didn't try to unclench her fingers. He simply held her hand, his thumb resting on her knuckles. The contact was electric. Through the thin wool of her glove and the heavy fabric of her coat, she felt a profound, radiating warmth. It was not the heat of a fire, but the steady, living heat of another human being. It was a simple, grounding touch, but it made her breath catch in her throat. For 13 years, no one had touched her with such simple, uncomplicated gentleness. The defensive wall she had built around her heart, brick by painstaking brick, suddenly developed a hairline crack. She slowly, deliberately, relaxed her fingers under his. His hand remained, a silent anchor in the twilight. They walked back to the cabin, the silence between them no longer empty, but charged with a new, tentative awareness. His warriors had made camp, a series of small, smokeless fires that glowed like fallen stars in the darkness. They were quiet, watchful, their presence a comforting balm. On the porch, under the faint light spilling from the cabin window, they stood facing each other. The space between them had shrunk. They were close enough to hear the soft whisper of each other's breathing, close enough to see the starlight reflected in each other's eyes. Chaska's face was serious, the lines of the leader returning. He hesitated, a flicker of doubt in his otherwise steady gaze. "Marin," he said, his voice low. "My presence here, my men. Cutter will see this as an act of war. I fear I have brought you more danger, not less." Marin looked up at him, at the man who had ridden 30 strong to honor a 13-year-old debt. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a clear, calm certainty. "The danger has been living in my yard since the night you left." "Chaska," she answered, her voice soft but firm. Her eyes, which had so often been narrowed in suspicion or hardened with resolve, were open, holding his gaze with a trust she hadn't offered another soul since Thomas. The danger was in the silence, It was in being alone. Tonight is the first time in a very long time that I have not felt alone. A wave of emotion passed over his face, relief, gratitude, and something deeper, something warmer. He lifted his hand, not to touch her, but to unwind the simple wool scarf from around his own neck. It was dark blue, worn soft with use. He reached out and gently draped it around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin for a fleeting moment. The scarf was warm from his body, and it carried his scent not of wood smoke, but of clean prairie grass, of cedar, of horse and leather. The scent was so simple, so real. It made her heart feel still and full. All at once, she lifted a hand and touched the soft wool at her throat, a gesture of quiet acceptance. He didn't step back. The small space between them vanished. He lowered his head, and she raised hers, and their foreheads met, resting against each other. It was an act of profound intimacy, a sharing of breath and space. They stood like that for a long moment, simply breathing, a slow, synchronized rhythm that was a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, and everything that was beginning. Marin, guided by an impulse she didn't question, lifted her hand from the scarf and gently, so gently, touched the scar above his eye. Her fingertip traced the thin, pale line. It was a piece of their history, a mark she had helped to make, a life she had helped to save. He closed his eyes at her touch, a small, shuddering breath escaping his lips. He was not just a protector. He was the boy she had saved, and in that touch, she was remembering him, and he was letting her. The embrace that followed was as natural and inevitable as the river flowing to the sea. There was no sudden movement, no desperate grab. It was a slow, mutual leaning in. His arms came around her, strong and sure, his hands resting on the small of her back. She did not stiffen. She did not pull away. She melted into him, resting her cheek against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of life, of strength, of safety. It was a rhythm that grounded her, that told her she was no longer an island. This was not a hug of passion, but of homecoming. It was a silent, shared admission. We survived. We survived to find each other again. When they finally drew their heads back, their faces were only inches apart. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of 13 years of waiting. He looked at her lips, and his gaze was a question. Her own eyes gave him the answer. The first kiss was as gentle as his touch had been. It was slow, hesitant, a soft pressure of lips against lips. It was a question, a test, a moment of profound vulnerability for two people who had spent their lives being strong. Then, as she responded, a soft sigh escaping her, the kiss deepened. It was not demanding, not hungry. It was a promise of presence, a confirmation of the safety she felt in his arms. A slow, deep warmth spread through her, starting in her chest and radiating out to the tips of her fingers, which trembled slightly where they rested on his arms. It was the warmth of a hearth that has been cold for too long, finally, unexpectedly, being rekindled when they finally drew apart. The night air felt cool on their heated skin. They looked at each other, a touch of shyness, of awkward wonder, in their eyes. They were no longer just the widow and the warrior. They were Marin and Chaska. A small, genuine smile touched Marin's lips. She brought a hand to her own mouth, as if surprised by the feeling. Practicality, her shield for so long, reasserted itself, but it was a softer, gentler version. "We have a big day tomorrow," she said, her voice a little hoarse, a little breathless. Chaska nodded, his own smile slow and warm, his eyes never leaving hers. "We do." He did not release her immediately. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and held it for a long, quiet moment before he finally stepped back. leaving the warmth of his scarf around her neck. "My men will stand watch. Sleep, Marin. You have earned your rest." He turned and walked from the porch, melting back into the shadows where his men waited, leaving her in the circle of light from her own window. That night, for the first time in 13 years, Marin Alder barred her door not out of fear, but out of habit. She lay down in her bed and, with the scent of cedar and prairie grass on the scarf beside her, she fell into a deep, dreamless, and peaceful sleep. Outside, the small campfires of Chaska's warriors burned steadily through the long, dark hours, a constellation of loyal stars, keeping watch, their quiet crackles and pops sounding like the beating of a heart, newly and bravely restarted. Dawn broke cold and clear, the air scrubbed clean by the night's tension. There was no victory in the silence, only a temporary reprieve. Marin knew Cutter was not a man to accept defeat. He would regroup, re-strategize, and return with the full, crushing weight of the corrupt law he now owned. They had won the Battle of the Yard. Now they had to win the war for the valley. The plan was forged in the quiet moments before sunrise, over a pot of strong, black coffee. It was not Marin's plan, nor Chaska's. It was a strategy born of their combined strengths, her knowledge of the town's heart, and his understanding of silent, swift action. They would not wait for Cutter's attack. They would bring the truth to light, not in Pike's tainted courtroom, but in the open, under the eyes of God and what remained of the community. But first, they needed the final piece of the puzzle. "The shack at Badger Cut," Marin said, her voice low. "When Pike was there, he kicked the red chest. He said, 'All this trouble for Cutter's bookkeeping. Stupid.' But he didn't seem worried. He was arrogant. He's hiding something else there, something more important than the ledger." Chaska nodded, his eyes distant, recalling the scene. "When we escaped, the floorboards. One of them was not right. The dirt beneath was too dark, too fresh. It had been disturbed recently. They needed a witness from the town, someone whose word was trusted, whose courage had not yet been extinguished." Marin thought of Lena Marsh, a weaver, a quiet woman whose husband had been a blacksmith, a good man driven out of business by Cutter's bank and a series of unfortunate accidents that left him unable to get parts. Lena had stayed, a silent, stubborn fixture in the town, her grief and anger woven into the threads of her loom. Marin had sent one of Chaska's young riders for her before first light. Lena arrived as the sky was turning from gray to pale rose. She was a small, stern woman with eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Marin's story without interruption, her hands, stained with dye, clasped in her lap. When Marin finished, Lena simply said, "My wagon is ready. The flour sacks are in the back. What do you need me to do?" At dawn, a small, determined party set out. Chaska led with two of his best trackers. Marin followed, her Winchester in hand, and beside her, a shawl pulled tight against the morning chill, walked Lena Marsh. They moved not along the road, but through the trees, their steps muffled by the damp earth. The old shack at Badger Cut was just as they had left it, a sagging testament to decay. Chaska went directly to the spot he remembered. He scraped away the dirt and, with the blade of his knife, pried up a floorboard that had been carefully cut and replaced. Beneath it was not a wooden chest, but the dull, gray iron of a small, modern safe. It was locked tight. One of Chaska's men produced a set of fine steel tools. He worked on the lock with the delicate precision of a surgeon. The only sounds, the faint, metallic clicks and the whisper of the wind through the broken window. After 10 tense minutes, there was a final, solid thunk. The door swung open. Inside, there was no money. There was something far more valuable. On top lay the official embossed seal of Redemption County, the real one, heavy and intricate. Beneath it was a thick stack of blank land transfer deeds. At the bottom of each one, in a familiar, scratchy hand, was the signature of Orrin Pike. They were all pre-signed. a stack of blank checks ready to cash in on the lives and lands of the valley's residents. This was the engine of Cutter's empire, the official stamp to make the theft look legal. Marin retrieved the deerskin ledger from a pouch at her side. She laid it in the safe, on top of the forged documents. She closed the heavy iron door, but did not lock it. She and Lena wrapped the entire safe in a heavy burlap sack. "Lena," Marin said, "we need to get this to the ferry landing by noon." "My husband used to deliver flour there every week," Lena replied, her voice steady. "No one will look twice." By mid-morning, a new and unusual energy was stirring in the town of Redemption. Chaska's young warriors, moving in pairs, had gone not to the homesteads, but to the town's remaining pillars. They had visited the new, nervous young pastor who had replaced Reverend Pruitt. They had spoken to Doc Albright, whose practice was slowly being choked by the debts he owed to Cutter's bank. They had stopped at the general store. The message was the same at each stop. A matter of public interest concerning the future of Sagebrush Bend will be discussed at the ferry landing at noon. Your presence, and the presence of all honest citizens, is requested. It was an invitation, not a threat, but it carried an undeniable weight. The ferry landing was the town's neutral ground. It was where commerce happened, where news was exchanged, where the river, the lifeblood of the valley, met the road. By noon, a small, curious crowd had gathered, perhaps 20 souls in all, the last remnants of a once thriving community. They stood in uncertain clusters, their faces a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. They watched as Lena Marsh guided her wagon to the center of the clearing. They watched as Marin Alder, the recluse, stepped down from the wagon, her face set and serious, and they watched with a mixture of awe and terror. As Chaska and his 30 warriors took up positions on the bluff overlooking the landing, they did not draw their weapons. They simply sat on their horses, a silent, watchful audience. A table was taken from Lena's wagon. The burlap-wrapped safe was placed upon it. Marin stood on one side, Lena on the other. Chaska walked into the center of the circle. He was not dressed as a warrior. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, and he carried no weapon. He spoke, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the still air. He did not shout accusations. He told a story. He told them of a pattern. He spoke of the northern camp, weakened by hunger and pride, and of a rich man who came offering not food, but whiskey and guns. He spoke of a plan to make the Sioux a scapegoat. He spoke of fires in the night, of wells gone sour, of cattle sickness that followed property lines. He did not name Cutter. He did not have to. He simply laid out the facts, one by one, like stones in a riverbed, for all to see. "Look around you," he finished, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "Ask yourselves why so many of your neighbors are gone. Ask yourselves who benefits when a good man is forced to sell his life's work for pennies on the dollar." He stepped back, and Marin stepped forward. She unwrapped the safe and opened its door. She took out the deerskin ledger. "This is Ephraim Cutter's ledger," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It details the payments. It details the plan." She opened it to a specific page, the smoke you all saw rising from the Hollis place yesterday morning. "Here it is. An entry. Made 1 month ago. Action Hollis Farm. Final clearing." It was all scheduled. A gasp went through the crowd. It was then that Orrin Pike arrived. 2 of his deputies at his side, he pushed his way through the crowd, his face a mask of theatrical outrage. "What is the meaning of this illegal assembly?" he boomed. "Marin Alder, you are under arrest for disturbing the peace and inciting a public nuisance." He reached for her arm, but before he could touch her, 5 of Chaska's warriors had dismounted. They did not draw their bows or rifles. They simply moved, creating a silent, impassable human barrier between Pike and the table. Pike stopped, his hand hovering in the air. He was a marshal, but he was suddenly, completely, without authority. A new figure appeared, parting the crowd with the sheer force of his presence. Ephraim Cutter. He was smiling, a look of amused condescension on his face. He held a sheaf of his own papers. "A town meeting," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How charmingly rustic. Marshal, I believe you have business with this woman, and I have business of my own." He held up his papers. "These are the finalized transfer deeds for the remaining properties in the valley. All signed, all legal. This gathering is irrelevant." "Is it?" Marin's voice was like ice. She reached into the safe and pulled out the stack of blank, pre-signed forms. "You mean these deeds, Mr. Cutter, the ones your marshal signed before anyone had even agreed to sell?" She scattered them on the table. "And it's a funny thing about signatures. When a dozen different people, all selling their land under duress, somehow manage to sign their names with the exact same handwriting, it starts to look less like a sale and more like a forgery." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cutter's smile faltered. The first crack in his dam of lies came from an unexpected source. Old Della Kincaid, a woman so frail the wind might knock her over, stepped forward. Her hand trembled, but her voice was surprisingly strong. She held up a crumpled, threatening letter, the kind made from cut-out words. "He said my well would be next," she said, her voice cracking. "He said I should take the offer before I had nothing left but dust." She pointed a trembling finger at Pike. "And he delivered it. He said he was just passing along a message." And here, at the bottom, he was so arrogant. He signed his initials. The crowd surged forward, their murmurs growing into an angry growl. Miles Grigg, the saloon owner, who had been hiding at the back of the crowd, began to sweat. He started to slip away, but Lena Marsh's voice, sharp as a weaver's needle, cut through the air. "Not so fast, Mr. Grigg." She stepped forward and unfurled a long bolt of canvas she had been holding. Pinned to it were dozens of slips of paper, tabs from the saloon, written in Grigg's own hand. "You have a very specific system. Don't you free drinks for Marshal Pike and his men, but only on certain nights. I took the liberty of getting a list of your tabs. It's funny, the dates you gave away all that free whiskey just happened to match the dates that the Boyd barn burned. And the Hollis well went bad. And Mrs. Kincaid got her letter." Grigg turned pale. The crowd's anger was now a palpable force, a rising tide of fury. It was at that moment, as the tension reached its breaking point, that a final figure appeared. He moved through the angry crowd, and they parted for him, as if by instinct. Tate Ironcloud. He was older, his face a mask of wrinkles, but he walked with an unbowed dignity that commanded respect from everyone, settler and Sioux alike. He did not speak. He walked directly to the table. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the forged deeds. He looked at Marin and gave a slow, deep nod of approval. Then he raised his hand, the string of polished black beads resting on his wrist, and placed it directly on top of the deerskin ledger. It was a silent testimony, a holy oath, the word of a respected elder, sealing the truth of the evidence before them. That was the moment Ephraim Cutter finally broke. His empire of lies, built over 13 years, had crumbled to dust in a single hour. The smile was gone, the condescension replaced by the raw, cornered fury of a predator. His hand dropped to the butt of the Colt revolver at his hip. He never cleared the leather. The sound was soft, but it cut through the angry shouts like a razor. On the bluff above, 10 of Chaska's warriors had drawn their bows. They did not raise them high. They were leveled. 10 arrows aimed directly at Cutter's heart. There was no shouted warning, no bluster, just the silent, deadly promise of 10 feathered shafts. Cutter's hand froze. His eyes flickered up to the bluff, then around at the faces in the crowd. He saw no fear. He saw no deference. He saw only judgment. He saw the faces of the people he had terrorized, and he knew they were no longer afraid of him. He was a king whose subjects had just discovered he had no clothes and no power. The law, his law, was gone. The only law left was the one being written here, at the ferry landing, by the collective will of a community that had finally found its voice. Slowly, deliberately, he let his hand fall away from his gun. The moment hung, stretched thin and taut as a bowstring. Ephraim Cutter's hand fell away from his gun, a gesture of surrender so profound it was more damning than any confession. On the bluff, 10 arrows remained aimed, 10 silent promises of a swift and final justice. The crowd, which had been a rising tide of anger, did not become a mob. The fury, given a voice, now sought not vengeance but order. It was the new pastor, a young man with a pale face and a spine made of surprising steel, who stepped forward into the circle. "The law has failed us," he said, his voice clear and steady. "So, we, the community of Sagebrush Bend, will make our own. We will write a petition, a testament to the crimes we have witnessed and the justice we demand." And so, the Court of the Prairie began. Lena Marsh produced a long roll of butcher's paper and an ink pot. One by one, the people of the valley came forward. Doc Albright, his hand steady, signed first, then old Della Kincaid, her spidery signature a testament to her courage, the store owner, the new blacksmith, the families who had been on the verge of fleeing. They all came. It was a slow, deliberate parade of defiance, each signature a nail in the coffin of Cutter's reign. The petition was simple. It called for the immediate removal of Orrin Pike from his office, citing his complicity in fraud, arson, and intimidation. It called for the assets of Ephraim Cutter and the Cormorant Ridge Development Corporation to be frozen, pending an investigation by an impartial federal marshal, and it decreed that Cutter's hired guns, Silas and another man identified by the crowd, be taken into custody. Pike sputtered, his face purple with impotent rage. But 2 stout farmers who had lost their land to his schemes stepped forward and, with a grim satisfaction, stripped the star from his vest. Chaska's warriors did not interfere. This was the town's justice, and they were merely its silent guardians. The 2 thugs, their bravado gone, were bound with rope from Lena's wagon. They were not taken to the town's jail, which was Pike's domain. They were locked in the blacksmith's old, solid iron shed, with one settler and one of Chaska's warriors standing guard together, a symbol of the new, shared law. The days that followed were not days of rest, but of renewal. The valley, which had been dying, was suddenly, miraculously, reborn. The first order of business was the water. Chaska, Marin, and a council of the remaining farmers formed the Sagebrush Bend Land and Water Cooperative, with Tate Ironcloud offering the wisdom of generations. They walked the banks of the Silver Thread. The dam that had diverted the creek to Cutter's land was dismantled, stone by stone. The water, clear and cold, was returned to its rightful course, and for the first time in years, the irrigation ditch at the Kincaid place ran full. Word spread, carried on the wind, by riders, and through Jedediah's mail pouch. The families who had been driven out, who were scattered in neighboring counties, heard the news, cautiously at first. Then, with a growing, hopeful tide, they began to return. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley again, a sound of life and construction. A community barn raising was held to replace the one Ansel Boyd had lost. Men who had once viewed each other with suspicion now worked side by side, heaving timbers into place. The wood was a mixture of pine from the settlers' lands and sturdy cedar donated by Chaska's people. When a new family's name was painted on a fresh plank and hung at the post office, the whole town felt the victory. Marin's farm became the heart of this new community. Her isolation was over. Her porch, once a defensive parapet, was now a place for meetings, for sharing coffee, for planning the future. One bright afternoon, with the whole valley seeming to watch, she took a small, healthy sapling from behind her barn, a direct descendant of the tree Thomas had planted. She chose a special spot for it, near the front gate, where the sun was best. as she tamped the rich earth around its roots. Lena Marsh called out, "What will you name this one? Maren, a new beginning deserves a name." Maren looked up, her eyes finding Chaska, who was standing quietly by the fence line, watching her. A slow, warm smile touched her lips. "This one," she announced, her voice carrying clearly, "is named Redleaf." A ripple of warm, appreciative laughter went through the small crowd. But Chaska did not laugh. He stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of profound, unguarded emotion. To have his name, the name of a Sioux, planted as a symbol of hope and new life in the heart of this valley. It was a gesture of acceptance so deep it left him breathless. He simply nodded at her, a gesture that conveyed a world of gratitude. The season turned. The hard work of rebuilding gave way to the satisfaction of a harvest, the first truly hopeful harvest the valley had known in over a decade. They held a celebration, not in the town, but on a wide, neutral meadow by the river. It was a festival of a new people. The keening of a fiddle mingled with the steady, powerful heartbeat of a native drum, creating a music that was strange, beautiful, and uniquely their own. Children, who had been taught to fear and mistrust, now ran together in wild, laughing packs, their games of tag crossing invisible lines, their shouts of joy knowing no tribe or color. They were simply the children of Sagebrush Bend. As the fires burned and the music played, Tate Ironcloud, leaning heavily on a staff, placed a hand on Chaska's shoulder. "From a boy lost in the snow to a man who leads," the old man said, his voice filled with a deep, quiet pride. "You have honored your debt. You have kept your promise." Chaska looked out at the mingled crowd, at the settlers and his own people sharing food and laughter around the same fires. He looked at Maren, who was showing Della Kincaid how to bake apples in the embers. "It was not I who saved them." "Uncle," Chaska replied, his voice low and certain. "It was they who saved us." Later that night, as the celebration began to wind down, Maren and Chaska found themselves walking away from the firelight, back to the quiet murmur of the river's edge. The moon was a silver sliver, and the light from the distant lanterns danced in their eyes, reflecting 1,000 unspoken thoughts. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, the shared quiet a testament to the deep understanding that had grown between them. It was Chaska who finally broke it, his voice filled with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "Maren," he began, his eyes on the dark water, "I came here to protect you, to repay the life you gave me. But now," he paused, searching for the words, "now, I find myself hoping that I might be allowed to stay for another reason." He turned to face her, his expression open and honest in the soft moonlight. His hand, as it had once before, found hers. This time there was no glove, no coat, just the warm, calloused skin of his palm against hers. Maren's heart, which had been so full of peace and contentment, now overflowed. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. She did not need words. She simply leaned her shoulder against his, a gesture of complete trust and belonging. The cool night air carried the scent of wood smoke and dry grass, and in that moment, she felt the rhythm of her own heartbeat slow, to match the steady, reassuring beat of his. He lowered his head, and she raised hers. The kiss, this time, was not a question. It was an answer. It was warm and certain, a quiet promise, not of passion, but of peace. It was not the hurried kiss of a storybook romance, but the slow, deep kiss of two survivors who had finally, against all odds, found their harbor. "What will we do?" she whispered against his lips, the question not one of doubt, but of shared anticipation. He kept her hand in his. "We will build," he said, "together." They talked then, their voices low murmurs in the night, their words weaving the fabric of a shared future. They planned a joint patrol, made of settlers and his own young men, to keep the peace on the ridges. They would turn the old, abandoned shack at Badger Cut, the arsenal of their enemy, into a schoolhouse where the children could learn to read and write during the long winter months. And they talked of her cabin. "It needs another room," she said, a smile in her voice. "A small guest house for travelers, for anyone who needs a safe place to rest." "This house will be open?" then he asked, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Yes," Marin said, her voice filled with a profound, final certainty. "It will be open, not from fear, but from choice. We will choose who we welcome." Later, back on the porch of her small, sturdy home, she took the string of black beads he had given her, with a piece of soft leather. She tied it, along with the one Tate had sent and the first one he had ever worn, to a nail beside her door. They hung there together 3 strings, 3 promises, 3 moments in time that had converged to become a single, unbreakable bond. They were the emblem of her home, a testament that a promise kept could become a shelter for all. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the new apple tree. In the sound, Marin could hear the whisper of the valley's new story. One person chose differently, and the whole valley learned to follow. The firelight from within the cabin cast a warm, golden glow. The quiet laughter of a man and a woman could be heard, mingling with the distant, fading beat of the festival drum. Sagebrush Bend was finally at peace, sleeping safely under a blanket of stars, its future secured by the quiet courage they had all built together, and the love that had been kindled in the heart of a winter storm, like the steady fire in Marin's hearth, would continue to burn, warm and bright, through all the seasons to come. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey into the Old West, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a thumbs up, and consider hitting the hype button to help share this tale with more listeners like you.